Chapter 26. The experience learned from history, Your Highness. What's the meaning of this? Carter thought Prince Roland was arbitrary before, but now he thought the prince had become divorced from reality. With regard to how to train a soldier, the chief knight thought that no one would be more professional than himself. His family had a complete set of training method, where a boy of 10 years old could be trained as a soldier, and would master all kinds of weapons in 5 years. If the soldier was further trained for 5 years, he would then be a top soldier, a knight who knew all rituals of upper class. Of course, the trainees could not come from a civilian family. Carter thought. Roland responded casually, "Just watch them, and remember they must be trained in this way for the next few days." "Of course, I'll make some changes, and I'll list down the details on paper." During the Cold War era, it was impossible to train a group of qualified soldiers in 2 or 3 months. And Roland had never thought of that, as he did not need that kind of Spartan warriors who were strong enough to tear a beast apart with bare arms. The individual soldiers did not have to be strong, but they had to be disciplined and execute every order without fail. The power of a unit was usually much stronger than individual strength. This was decided by social norm and acceptance. So he needed to form them into a unit quickly. The modern military training, with some modifications to suit the current situation, was a good choice. In his personal experience of military training, it took only half a month to integrate students from all over the country into a cohesive unit. The effect was very obvious regardless of the process. Only when this group of people completely understood the importance of discipline, could Roland implement the next step of his plan. Van Singlecotier still failed to get the second egg at the end. They had to stand twice as long as the previous round, and it did not end until someone's legs went weak and trembled. Just then, Prince Roland announced to have a rest and ordered the attendants to serve lunch. People's anger at the weakling was successfully transmuted into the eagerness toward food. Of course, Van Singlecotier began to suspect that His Highness probably had never intended to let them get a second reward. Lunch was packed in 4 large pots, which was transported by carriages to the outside of the town. In addition to food, they also brought a lot of wooden bowls and spoons. Van Singlecotier licked his lips, ready to rush to the carriages with the others, but was held back by the chief knight. His Royal Highness ordered all the people to line up in 4 rows and come forward one by one for bowls and spoons. Whoever dared to disturb the order would be forced to be the last one to get his food. The crowd hustled and squeezed, and lined up into 4 rows. Van Singlecotier was lucky enough to stand in the forefront of the outermost row. Of course, some people were not satisfied with their positions. The sound of quarrels and fighting was heard in the rows. Soon the knights and several guards rushed into the crowd and kicked the troublemakers out. Thought Van Singlecotier when he glanced at the man who started the riot. That was Insane Fist, the most aggressive street fighter in the town. He used to stir up trouble everywhere with his brute force, but now he had to squat in the corner with swords pointed at him. Look how pitiful he was now. He felt that he had already figured out what His Royal Highness liked. He liked order. They had to stand upright in a straight line up to get food, and always follow orders. Van Singlecotier had heard from some knowledgeable businessmen that some of the noble had a strange habit. They could not tolerate disorder, and once something was out of place, they could not help rearranging things. In Van Singlecotier's mind, this kind of person was purely bored and had nothing better to do. So they would deliberately create some trouble to occupy their mind. He did not expect that His Royal Highness was such a person. When the lids of the pots were opened, Van Single-Tr smelled the strong flavor of food. When the flavor spread in the wind, he almost lost himself in it. The crowd also became restless, but soon the night roared to keep them quiet. Van Single-Tr thought. Sure enough, Prince Roland required them to line up for their portions of food just like before. Their mouths were watering and their stomachs were growling. But thinking of what happened to Insane Fist, they had to line up and wait patiently. The pots were filled with hot oatmeal. To Van Single-Tr's surprise, there was even dried meat in the porridge. Even if he only got one thin slice, but that was meat. In addition, he even got an extra egg like he wished for. Van Single-Tr gobbled down the porridge, even licking the bottom of the bowl once. He swallowed the entire egg without biting. Since he ate so fast and carelessly, his tongue blistered quickly. After putting down the pot, Van Single-Tr patted his belly and made a satisfied hiccup. He had not enjoyed such delicious food for a long time. And what was even more incredible was that he even felt a sense of satiety. Compared with brown bread, the sweetmeat porridge tasted like heaven. He even thought, if he could eat such food every day, what would it matter if he had to fight against the demonic beasts in the front? After lunch, they had a long period of rest. They were brought back within the city wall, walking all the way to the camp of the battalion. A burly man of foreign nation came out and began to teach everyone how to set up tents. Van Single-Tr knew him. Nearly everyone in the town knew Iron Axe. With regards to his superb archery skill, he even far surpassed the most experienced old hunters in the town. Wait a moment, so now Iron Axe is serving Prince Roland? It seemed that I saw him by the side of the knights before. Van Single-Tr frowned and thought, what's His Highness planning? Iron Axe is a man of some nation. Do you really intend to appoint a man of some nation as captain? Carter had the same question. He doesn't belong to Kingdom of Greycastle. And he isn't even from our continent. The witches don't belong to the Kingdom of Greycastle either, Roland said, but they all belong to Border Town. Besides, aren't you watching them for me? But, Your Highness, don't worry. Roland patted the knight's shoulder. The origin of a person doesn't matter in Border Town. As long as they don't violate the law of the kingdom, they're still my subjects. If you're really worried, you can choose 2 more excellent captains. Anyway, the team will continue to expand in the future, and you can cultivate some promising ones now. I have written down the training regulations. Compared to the people of some nation, I think you'd better be more concerned about this. Carter took the parchment roll from Roland's hands. Skimming through the contents from beginning to end, he got a nasty shock. The training contents were almost unheard of. For example, they needed to run laps around Border Town in the afternoon from 2 p.m. till sunset. The regulations emphasized that everyone had to complete this, and they were allowed to help each other on the way. If they persevered and no one gave up, they would get an extra egg for dinner. Another example, when the whistles were blown at night, everyone had to get dressed and fall in as soon as possible. With these kinds of training exercises, Carter was afraid that most people would quit in a few days. The first few rules were already hard to understand, and the last one completely confused him. Every day after dinner, they're required to go to Mr. Carl's college for cultural training. Your Highness, what do you mean by cultural training? Do you want to teach them to read and write? I hope so, but the time is too limited. Carl could only teach them some simple words and numbers so that they can read and write orders. I'll personally explain this part to Carl. You just need to send them over. But, why do you want to do this? It's of no use in fighting against the demonic beasts. Who said so? Roland yawned. A unit good at fighting must also be well educated. That's the experience learned from history. Chapter 27, The Past. The weather was getting colder day by day, and Roland was waking up later and later. As the ruling class, he certainly had the right to sleep late. Especially with his large bed and 3 layers of velvet blankets, his whole body would fall into the soft encirclement when lying down. This made it much harder for him to get up early. After washing up, Roland stepped into his office and found Nightingale had been waiting there for a long time. "Well, here is your breakfast. I ate half when it was hot, but now it's cold," she said, with her lips protruding. She nodded her head in the direction of the remaining bread on the table, as if she was the lord of the domain. "Hasn't anyone taught you to be humble before the prince?" asked Roland, as he pushed away the plates and sat at the desk. "I remember you were very polite at first." He sighed inwardly. He had not realized that she made friends instantly, and she would always be accompanying Anna or him. She had kept hidden at first, but now, as long as there was no outsider present, she would stroll around his office, and not even wearing a hood. "Like this?" She jumped off the table and bowed in the style and etiquette of a flawless noble. "You've been getting up later and later recently. Since the breakfast remained unconsumed, I wanted to do you a favor by helping myself to some of it, Your Highness." She walked toward Roland and said, "You don't care, do you? I can see that you don't like the tedious etiquette." Did she have a third eye? Roland wondered silently. She could see even this. He sighed. "As you like, but you'd better finish the breakfast once you start it in the future. I'll order another portion if I want to eat it." "Yes, Your Highness." She smiled and picked up the plate, moving quickly to one side. Roland rolled out a blank parchment. He was ready to complete the design drawing, left unfinished from yesterday. If he wanted to defend Border Town, he should not pursue a win with an almost equal loss in the first battle of winter. Since a corporation that had not experienced war was not a qualified one, Roland feared that if there was any major loss, his soldiers, who had only been trained for a short time, would not have the courage to stand on the city wall. He needed epical weapons in order to have an absolute advantage over the demonic beasts. There was no doubt that he needed the flintlock. The era was equipped with all the conditions for the emergence of the flintlock. The alchemists often produced something they called snow powder for palace celebrations. It was essentially gunpowder, but with the wrong formula and could burn slowly. When put into the copper tube, it mostly just made a small sound. In about 1 century, the prototype of the flintlock, the harquebus, would appear. The firearm had a complicated operation, which relied on the cooperation of 2 people doing the loading and shooting. In general, it could only be used as a single-shot weapon. As for its speed and power, it was no match for a trained archer. Roland, of course, was not interested in repeating history. It was better to make use of the witch's ability and create a flintlock with practical value, just like he had created the steam engine. "I had looked at the order on the table before you came." Nightingale swallowed the last piece of bread and asked casually, "What are you going to do with so many ices?" "It's winter now, and if you want to drink cold ale, why not directly put it outside for one night?" The noble liked to use ice during summer, namely, the ice made of saltpeter. Then they could cool their milk, wine or juice for enjoyment. Thanks to winter's blessing, the current purchasing price for saltpeter was very low. To make iced cheese, the temperature is not low enough yet. "It doesn't work well without freezing," Roland replied precariously. Although the woman in front of him was not his enemy, he did not know her as well as he knew Anna. Unlike the steam engine, there were not so many technical barriers to the flintlock. Once it became popular, it would obviously be unfavorable to his farming project. Until he learned more about her, it was better to keep some things from her. Thinking of this, he tentatively asked, "Does the Witch Cooperation Association help to train killers in addition to searching for Holy Mountain?" "No, they're only a group of poor people coming together for a dream," Nightingale waved and said, "and I joined the Witch Cooperation Association only 2 years ago." "In other words, you were working for someone else?" She could not have gained such perfect dagger-throwing skills without someone's guidance or years of hard work. Roland was pretty sure about it. "Other than me, is there anyone else willing to take in a witch?" "Taken?" Nightingale looked a bit strange. How could it be? If he had known that I would become a witch, he wouldn't have even let me through his door. As for later on, if I had not proved my usefulness to him, I'd have been secretly killed. "Oh? Can you elaborate?" Nightingale shook her head with a smile, which contained slightly inexpressible moods this time. "Your Highness, I'll let you know when the time is right. I know what you're worried about. Please rest assured that I have been free for the last 5 years, and no longer work for others." Negotiations failed. It seemed that he was not charming enough. However, her answer indirectly confirmed his speculations. At least 5 years ago, she had secretly done something for someone. Fortunately, the person had only used Nightingale by chance, instead of recruiting large numbers of witches like he intended to. Roland did not ask more. He bowed his head and went on with the drawings. To his surprise, Nightingale, who had always liked being around him, became quiet, only leaving the sound of furnace fire burning in the room. When Roland lifted his head to stretch his limp, numb neck, she had left the office. "She didn't say goodbye," he muttered, folding the parchment and putting it into the inner pocket of his underclothes. He worked for a few days. He finished all the work, including the drawings, and the designs of the weapons, or the copies. He was planning to make the famous flintlock, which was time-tested and similar to the harquebus in terms of the technique level, with the ignition charge loaded into the rear, and the lead ball loaded into the front. Its rate could be nearly 3 shots per minute. So more than sufficiently, it could be used to cope with the unintelligent mutant beasts. Most animals would not be able to climb the wall, so the shooting distance was approximately equal to the distance from the top of the city wall to the ground, approximately 4 meters. Within this distance, it was hard to miss the target, and the initial speed of the bullet would hardly decrease. As long as the demonic beasts had not evolved with a skin harder than steel, they could basically be killed in one shot. The disadvantage of the flintlock was its long production time. At first, like the harquebus, it was made by craftsmen's repeated beats with a hammer. From the barrel to the trigger, it took about 3 months to make the whole gun. Among all the parts, the barrel was the most time-consuming. The craftsman had to beat the iron sheet into a thin and cylindrical shape, seal it with iron powder, and then engrave the rifling. Although there was no need for precise instruments, the craftsman must be skilled in order to make qualified barrels. This was why Roland had produced the steam engine first. With the steam engine available, he could directly drill a barrel into a solid iron bar with the steel drill. So, the production speed would be greatly improved, without any more reliance on the operation by the skilled craftsman. The only thing he needed would be a table on which he could fix the iron bar. Chapter 28, Fierce Scar. But when Roland operated it himself, he realized the actual situation was not as simple as he had expected. After slogging in the backyard for 4 or 5 days, the harder drill bits were completed successfully though. With the use of Anna's flame at a high temperature, he could easily get molten iron at over 1500 Celsius degrees. Without any temperature constraint, he could quickly and easily produce small quantities of steel with the conventional rod steel method. By stirring the molten iron with an iron bar, the excessive carbon and other impurities in the pig iron would oxidize in the air, and after repeating the operation several times, the premium steel appeared as the molten iron cooled down. The problem lay in the first steam engine. When this primitive machine was working, it created loud noise and high-frequency vibration. As a result, the drill could not stably finish drilling the entire solid iron. In rough labor, this degree of tremor did not matter, but this clearly would not work with the processing of the barrel. To improve this situation, he had to create a centrifugal governor to control the output power of the steam engine, and then use a gear assembly to reduce the vibration, and adjust the bit rotation rate. Plus, the machining gears required a simple lathe. By the look of things, Roland found himself unable to achieve his goal before the arrival of the months of demons. Eventually, he could only apply the old method of asking the blacksmiths to gradually hammer it out. The plan to mass-produce flintlocks did not succeed. According to the number of blacksmith shops in Border Town, a maximum of 3 to 4 barrels could be produced monthly, which should be on the condition that the production of the second steam engine was stopped. The only consolation was that there was no need to worry about the pass rate of the barrel. The blacksmith just needed to beat the approximate shape of round tubes. Anna would do the pipe linking. The effect was close to the seamless tube cut out by the boring tool, and basically eliminated the risk of the gun barrel explosion. Roland had no choice but to revise his previous plan. He had intended to recruit hunters from Border Town to set up a flintlock squad. They were mostly proficient in archery, and both the bow and crossbow were their handy weapons. Plus, a firearm training was not time-consuming, so they could be ready for combat very soon. But from now up till the months of demons, only 4 flintlock guns could be made. In this way, only the most outstanding of the hunters could form an elite team. Roland decided to entrust this matter to Iron Axe to carry out. He had stayed in Border Town for 15 years, and was also generally recognized as the best hunter. Brian was unhappy this past half-month. Especially when he met the militia team in the street, his unhappiness doubled. He even could not reconcile himself to what had happened. He felt that he had been forgotten by His Highness. A month ago when he was summoned by the Chief Knight, he was full of excitement. Being in close contact with Prince Roland and questioned by His Highness himself was a very fortunate and glorious matter. He was born in an ordinary hunting family and grew up in Border Town. By virtue of his own abilities, he became patrol leader. He knew he could not rely on his background to become a knight, but could only wait for the opportunity to make a merit, and accept the conferral by the authorities. His Highness' inquiry made him sense the opportunity had come. Apparently Prince Roland did not want to give up his domain and was trying to find ways to fight the demonic beasts. Later on, the massive construction of the city wall proved without a doubt that this year they would be spending the months of demons in Border Town. If His Highness wanted to prevent the invasion of demonic beasts here, he had to set up a platoon brave enough for a face-to-face combat. Brian thought he himself was the best choice for the role, as he was proficient in investigation, swordsmanship and equestrian skill. Every year, he would remain till the time for the garrison duty to ignite the beacon fire to prove his courage. But he never expected that His Highness would plan to choose a platoon from the populace to fight with the demonic beasts. Yes, it was a platoon of civilians. Furthermore, the whole patrol team of 10 people, including him, did not pass the review by the chief knight. This was simply incredible. Did His Highness felt that these civilians who had never held swords would be better than him in battle? It was more likely they would disperse once they saw the fiendish faces of the demonic beasts. But His Highness seemed to be serious. He was not only training this group of mobs, but also gave them uniforms. Every afternoon, Brian could see this group of people wearing brown and gray leather armor, filed in 2 lines running on the streets. At the beginning, the platoon was messy, but recently it became much neater. But every day, he could only carry out boring tasks, without any hope of promotion. At night, while he was tossing and turning, there was a loud noise next door. The door was pushed open, and someone came in quietly. "Hey, get up! All of you," he whispered. Brian recognized his voice. He was a member of the patrol team and nicknamed Fierce Scar. There were 5 people in his room. Other than Greyhound and himself, the other 3 quickly got up, as if they had already been preparing for this as they slept with their coats on. "Captain, get up quickly. I have something important to tell you." Fierce Scar had a noble relative in Longsong Stronghold, who was said to be a great noble. Hence his position was very high in the team. Brian could not ignore him, so he got up and asked, "What happened?" Greyhound was also awakened. It's so late, don't you guys go to bed? I have a good job for you. Do you want to be conferred as a knight?" What? Knight?" Greyhound exclaimed. Brian's heart skipped a beat and quickly asked, "What's the job exactly?" "You all know my uncle Hurt. He's the Earl conferred by the Duke, and also the Duke's confidant. He personally told me this." Fierce Scar lowered his voice. "Prince Roland is ready to cast off Longsong's stronghold, and this has displeased the Duke greatly. The Duke has decided to let the prince know that only he is the master of the western region. Didn't he tell me you intend to assassinate?" Greyhound stuttered once he got nervous, and could not complete his sentences. "How could it be?" Fierce Scar said, tittering. "He is a prince after all. If he's dead, even the Duke cannot protect us. As I said, it's a good job." Brian subconsciously felt that the deal was not as simple as he claimed. But the temptation of being a knight was so great that he could not help but reply, "Tell me more." "Grain. If there's no food, he'll have no choice but come back to Longsong's stronghold. The Duke promised that as long as we can successfully burn the grain bought by Prince Roland, he'll make us knights. And even give us a piece of land in the eastern Longsong stronghold. It's a golden opportunity. Captain, what do you think of it?" You're crazy. His Highness has already said, this year, the months of demons is likely to last for more than 4 months. If you burn the grain, what will we eat?" Greyhound shook his head repeatedly. "Have we all forgotten what happened 2 years ago? What does that have to do with us?" The other man remarked with disdain. "Anyway, I didn't intend to stay here. After finishing Duke Ryan's task, I'll be able to live a good life in Longsong's stronghold." "That's right. Do you want to stay in this dump and eat furnace slag forever?" The others echoed the view. Damn, they were in cahoots. Brian's heart sank. Only Greyhound and him grew up in border town, the rest came from all parts of the country and did not have any special feelings towards the town. Sensing it pointless to stop them, he changed the subject. "But the wheat has already been transferred to His Highness Castle. With the entrance guarded by personal knights, how could you enter it?" "That's why I've asked you to join." Fierce Scar laughed confidently. "You've stayed in this dump since you were young. so no one knows this environment better than you. I remember you once said the well at the back mountain was connected to the waterway at the bottom of the castle. Through it, you can quietly access the castle garden. You even crawled through it when you were a child. So if you join me, you can become a knight in the future, and even personally conferred by the Duke. No knights should be courageous and fight unfairness. They should not be afraid of powers of coercion, but should protect the weak. Just for the sake of the Duke's personal grudges, why should we expose the town residents to the threat of hunger and death? Such a knight is just an empty shell, without any glory at all. As he was about to refuse, Greyhound shouted, "A group of madmen. You actually dare to mess with the grain. I'll never let you leave H here." I want to our report to Greyhound was in mid-speech when the sound solidified. He turned around in disbelief, as a former teammate stood behind him, sneering. A black dagger thrust into his back and entered the body completely. He trembled twice, opened his mouth trying to say something, but could only utter a hoarse breathing sound. The attacker swiftly moved the dagger twice, and then violently pulled it back. Greyhound suddenly lost the support like a lifeless doll, and collapsed softly to the ground. And so? Fierce Scar came close to Brian, who could even feel the stench of his mouth. "I think you have decided. Right, Captain?" Chapter 29, Brian's Anger. The Lord's castle in Border Town had not been originally built in its current position. Whilst burying the foundation of the stone wall, an underground cave was uncovered. The ground suddenly collapsed, so there was no choice but to move the position of the castle. The waterways that had already been dug were mostly destroyed during the collapse. Even those that were intact were abandoned because of the reconstruction. When Brian was young, he often played in these tunnels, and one day he accidentally found that the route from an abandoned well led to the well of the castle garden. Brian told his father, and was severely beaten. His father warned him that the punishment for trespassing the castle was death. Once found guilty, he would be sent straight to the gallows. Brian was terrified and naturally did not walk through the waterway again. But at times when everyone got together to drink and chat, he had more than once boasted that he knew a direct access to the castle. Now he regretted his remarks. Excluding Greyhound, there were a total of 9 people. In other words, the entire patrol team had been persuaded by Fierce Scar, being able to serve Duke Ryan, the Lord of the Western region, with such a lucrative return, was a temptation few people could resist. The abandoned well was located at the outset of the collapse, and now it remained a wasteland. Held by Fierce Scar's sword and caught in the middle of the platoon, Brian went down the well. What was once a spacious waterway, was now very narrow. No one had passed through in years, plus the water direction had changed. Many vines had sprouted all over the cave. The bloke who had stabbed Greyhound was in front holding the torch and bowed. He held a short axe and used it to remove obstacles. Brian pretended he was trying to remember the road, but in fact Chapter 29, Brian's Anger. The Lord's castle in Border Town had not been originally built in its current position. Whilst burying the foundation of the stone wall, an underground cave was uncovered. The ground suddenly collapsed, so there was no choice but to move the position of the castle. The waterways that had already been dug were mostly destroyed during the collapse. Even those that were intact were abandoned because of the reconstruction. When Brian was young, he often played in these tunnels, and one day he accidentally found that the route from an abandoned well led to the well of the castle garden. Brian told his father, and was severely beaten. His father warned him that the punishment for trespassing the castle was death. Once found guilty, he would be sent straight to the gallows. Brian was terrified and naturally did not walk through the waterway again. But at times when everyone got together to drink and chat, he had more than once boasted that he knew a direct access to the castle. Now he regretted his remarks. Excluding Greyhound, there were a total of 9 people. In other words, the entire patrol team had been persuaded by Fierce Scar, being able to serve Duke Ryan, the Lord of the Western region, with such a lucrative return, was a temptation few people could resist. The abandoned well was located at the outset of the collapse, and now it remained a wasteland. Held by Fierce Scar's sword and caught in the middle of the platoon, Brian went down the well. What was once a spacious waterway was now very narrow. No one had passed through in years, plus the water direction had changed. Many vines had sprouted all over the cave. The bloke who had stabbed Greyhound was in front holding the torch and bowed. He held a short axe and used it to remove obstacles. Brian pretended he was trying to remember the road, but in fact, he was thinking about getting away. Obviously in such an inconvenient place, he had no possibility of escaping. He could only wait till he got to the castle, before getting a chance. What should he do once he got there? Shout to attract the personal knights of His Highness? No. Fierce Scar would raise his hand and finish him off. He had to lengthen their distance first, otherwise he would end up like Greyhound. Thinking about Greyhound, Brian's eyes became bleak again. He and Greyhound had lived in Border Town before it was even established. The two had spent their childhood together and joining the patrol team was also Brian's idea. He had not expected that Greyhound would be elected as the patrol team leader. Brian was happy for him for a long time. Because of his stutter, Greyhound had always been despised by others. Now, he had finally gotten the opportunity to be recognized. At least at the time, it was what Brian thought. But when Greyhound fell and Brian screamed, Fierce Scar told him the real reason they had been elected captains. Fool, patrol leaders have to stay until the months of demons, to ignite the flames and warn everyone. If you two didn't do it, did you expect me to do it myself? The sentence was like a sharp knife piercing Brian's heart. All those compliments and congratulations were false, and the real reason was actually so ugly. He showed a look of shock and despair to cover up his raging anger. It was simply unforgivable. Brian secretly clenched his teeth. Someone had to pay the price. After walking through the dried-up waterway for half an hour, they finally heard the sound of water. This meant that they were not far from their destination. After turning a corner, it suddenly became more spacious, and could accommodate 2 people standing side by side. The person walking at the head of the platoon said, "There's no way forward, just a shaft." "What's happening?" Fierce Scar nudged the sword and asked. "Ask him to look up," said Brian. "We have arrived." The abandoned waterway was connected to the middle of the castle backyard's waterway. Perhaps it had not been sealed shut due to negligence. Fierce Scar stuck to the wall and looked up. 3 feet below him was gushing water, and above his head he could see a small circle of the night sky. He let people guard Brian, while he pulled out a rope from the backpack, tied the hook, and gently threw it up. When a dang sound was heard, the hook was firmly stuck in the edge of the well's head. Fierce Scar followed the rope, and carefully climbed up. Soon, he tugged the rope several times above, indicating that the rest of the people could come up. The line of people took almost half a day's efforts to climb out from the well. The castle, which was originally far from sight, now stood erect in front of them. Fierce Scar grabbed Brian and shouted, "Hurry and take us to the warehouse." Brian had only come here once. Though the memory of the castle was obscure, he quietly led the crowd, pried open the nearest wooden door, and slipped into the castle. At this hour, most people inside the castle were asleep, and the lamp lights along the corridor walls were completely extinguished. In the pitch-black darkness, someone from the platoon lit a fire. Faint fire could only illuminate a few feet, and Brian knew his chance had come. When the platoon went to a crossing leading to the basement, he aimed at the bottom of the ladder, and suddenly rushed over. Although the person who held Brian had been paying attention to his movements, but the leap was too fast. Before he could react, he collided and began rolling down with Brian. Down the ladder, the two instantly came out of the fire's range, and disappeared in the darkness. Oh, damn. Fierce Scar immediately pulled out the dagger, and chased after them. He thought Brian would use the dark to play hide-and-seek with him. But not only did Brian not escape, he was also quietly standing under the stairs, as if waiting for him. Fierce Scar saw that the associate who collided with Brian was lying on the ground motionless. And Brian was holding the man's weapons in his hand. Fool, do you think you'll have a chance to win? Fierce Scar held his attack stance, waiting for the others to come down, and then said, "There are 7 of us, and only 1 of you." Brian did not answer, and he no longer needed to suppress his anger. He swung the sword, and swiftly struck the peak of Fierce Scar's sword, with sparks flying. Without waiting for the next stance, he stabbed the sword into Fierce Scar's shoulder. Fierce Scar roared and fell backwards. Another one stepped forward, blocking the pursuit of Brian. This was an excellent place to strike, as the narrow aisle gave the opponents hardly any advantages. He just had to stand in the middle of the aisle facing the enemy, and the opponents could not do anything. It was just too narrow here to accommodate 2 people waving weapons. With regards to swordsmanship, Brian was confident he would not lose to anyone of the patrol team. When this group of scum was lazing around, gambling, and indulging in the bar, he was honing his fighting skills. Regardless of wind, frost, rain or snow, years went by and his routine was never interrupted. This was also why he did not choose to immediately shout for help. He wanted to personally avenge Greyhound's death. Chapter 30. Coming from the mist, the enemy only blocked Brian's 2 strikes before his weapons were knocked down. Brian thought angrily. Other than blackmail and extortion, what else have they done? Greyhound and I meticulously performed the tasks given by the Lord, but ended up being the weird ones out of the team. But it just so happened, this group of scum, in order to join Longsong's stronghold, did not care about what happened to the town, and used despicable methods to kill Greyhound. Unforgivable. He wielded the sword, aiming toward a frightened opponent's neck. At this moment, a shadow emerged from the target, and swiftly stabbed close to Brian's heart. This blow was too concealed, so when he detected it, it was already too late. In desperation, he crashed backwards to the ground, his body popping up, and felt a stabbing pain at his chest. After rolling a few laps, Brian immediately stood up and put on a defensive stance. That sword attack only pierced his coat and skin, and there was no serious harm done. But the main point was who did the attack. He did not know any guy in the patrol team with such a fencing skill. Huh? You actually dodged the attack. The man pushed away his teammate and came forward. By the firelight, Brian found he did not know that person. He was not tall, and yet his hands were very long, hanging down almost to the knees. His face was unfamiliar, and Brian vowed he had never seen this face before. "You're not from the patrol team, who are you exactly?" Despite having few dealings with the 5 people next door, but at least he recognized them. This guy obviously replaced one of them, followed the team in and infiltrated the castle. It was not surprising that he did not discover him in the middle of the night, but it was impossible that Fierce Scar did not notice as well. Since they did not seem surprised, then there was only one explanation: that this guy was deliberately arranged by Fierce Scar. You already know the answer, so why asking me? He smiled indifferently. Anyway, you're going to die. Damn, he's injured me. Fierce Scar shouted hatefully. Viper, chop off his hands and feet, and I want to slowly drain his blood. Unfortunately, Mr. Kills, I have to first complete the tasks of the Earl. Without much pause, the guy known as Viper continued attacking. His movement was swift and mysterious, plus his abnormally long arms, forcing Brian into a bitter struggle. Brian was forced to retreat, and simply could not find an opportunity to counterattack. Brian began to feel anxious. He wanted to personally revenge Greyhound's death, but yet now he only wished he could hold on a little longer, till the guards of His Royal Highness came to ambush this group of villains. You seem to be expecting something. Viper suddenly paused attacking. I guess you're waiting for the prince's men to save you? Unfortunately, this stone castle is different from your usual pubs and hotels. In those wooden houses, the floors would creak when people were entertaining. But here, as long as the door was closed, you could shout at the top of your lungs, and no one would hear any movement upstairs. After Brian's thoughts had been exposed, he could not help but hesitate, and Viper was waiting exactly for this opportunity. He kept the sword pointing down to dull the opponent while slightly raised the other hand to trigger the hand crossbow in the sleeve. A bolt with just a finger's length was shot from the cuff, and once Brian heard the light buzzing of the machine, the bolt was already thrust in his lung. Unbearable pain suddenly exploded in his chest. Brian threw the sword at Viper, and turned back to run. But the blood from the lung exuded quickly into the trachea, making it difficult for him to breathe. He did not run far, before he tripped over the threshold, with a staggering heavy fall to the ground. Viper caught up with him, and wanted to terminate his opponent, but was stopped by Fierce Scar. Let me do it, he said, gnashing his teeth. I want this guy to know what happens to those who stab me. A trace of cool flashed across Viper's face, but he eventually moved aside. Do it efficiently, and don't forget our main business. Fierce Scar grabbed Brian's hair and shouted at him, believe me, you'll die a very painful death. Brian wanted to spit some blood on his face, but his whole body's strength was draining away, and he knew he did not have long to live. Past regrets surged to his heart, such as the wife he had not yet met, and the dream to be a knight. But the most regrettable was being unable to avenge Greyhound. Wait, what was that? He blinked, and there was a woman sitting on top of a box. Although under the dim light, her look was not clear, that exquisite body proved clearly that she was without doubt a woman. Hell, was this an illusion? When he fell into the room, he did not see anyone inside. Did the deities in heaven hear his complaints, and deliberately created a fantasy to comfort him? Hey, you guys are not only fighting in other people's territory, and even intend to kill right in front of me. Don't you think that's inappropriate? Brian could feel Fierce Scar's hand tremble, and let loose his hair. He could hear sounds of weapons bursting out of the sheath, and some shouts. Who are you? Brian was thinking hazily. Of course I'm from here. The woman jumped from the barrel, and patted the dust from her robe. In the dim firelight, Brian saw her gown was embroidered with a strange pattern, 3 juxtaposed triangles, and a huge eye in the center. The silhouette of the eye shone golden bright under the firelight. "What about you guys? Rats that come from the gutter?" Her voice was crisp and sweet, yet without any emotion. This was unreasonable. Anyone who saw a murder scene would not behave so calm. Viper was also aware of this. He looked somber, walked slowly around the other's side, and suddenly stabbed her. The woman did not even turn her head, but casually waved her hand. Viper did not even see her weapon, but just felt a burst of cold wind blowing through his body. There was a scream. Fierce Scar stared incredulously, and he saw Viper rush forward and retreat quickly. But the original sight of the sword was now an empty space. His arms fell to the ground, as well as the sword. Fear suddenly strangled Fierce Scar's throat. The others might not know, but he was very clear about Viper's bottom line: vicious, dangerous and cunning when attacks. This was the Earl's evaluation of this person. Someone who could be chosen and recruited by the Earl, only meant his strength should not be underestimated. Even Brian would have difficulty in resisting his attack for more than half a quarter. But now, he was nonchalantly attacked by a woman, and his whole arm severed. "What are you guys waiting for? Hurry and kill her!" Viper shouted, holding his wound. After having lost a lot of blood, Brian's vision began to blur. He heard chaotic sounds of footsteps, weapons, collision, and muffled sounds when bodies fell to the ground. What had happened exactly? He tried to turn his eyes, looking forward, and then the patrol leader saw an image he could not understand. That woman's figure was like a ghost, and she strolled amongst the crowd, disappearing and appearing at times. Every attack would penetrate the enemy's vital point. It did not seem like a fight, and it looked more like a dance. He had never seen anyone use weapons with such a sense of rhythm. The sword shadow was flying up and down, and drawing an incredible orbit. The people around seemed like clumsy clowns, compared to her. They futilely counterattacked, and then fell in vain in the end. She was the only person proudly standing. That was also the last sight Brian saw before losing consciousness. Chapter 31, Friend. Roland was sitting at his desk dumbfounded. He had never expected that someone would dare to commit murder in his castle. If Nightingale had not found the assassins in time, they would have killed him. Who had plotted the assassination attempt this time? Was it his third sister? Or the other siblings? Why were they so anxious? The royal decree on the selection of Crown Prince would last for 5 years, and it was only a few months that had passed. Roland slammed the desk in growing agitation. Footsteps sounded from outside the door. Chief Knight Carter Lannis swung the door open and entered. "Your Highness, the identity of the bodies has been clarified. 7 of the 8 corpses were former members of the patrol team, and one person's identity is still unknown. Of the 2 who are still alive, one is still unconscious after being healed by the witch, by Miss Pine. Another has been cast in a cell and is being cautiously guarded." Patrol team? He knew that this team, trained by the former lord, was unreliable. Roland gnashed his teeth in vexation. 8 out of 10 members were disloyal. It was truly the right decision to forbid these bastards from joining the militia. Warn the guards to watch the one that's locked up in jail carefully. Don't let him poison himself like the last time. The last time? Never mind. Roland shook his head. Nightingale had woken him up at midnight and his mind was a blur. Anyway, I have to hear everything from his mouth. The chief plotter, the primary contact person, and the buyer, we need to find these people. "Yes, Your Highness," Carter responded but did not depart at once. Instead, He got down on one knee. It was my dereliction of duty that allowed the assassins to sneak into the castle. Please punish me, Your Highness. Enough. You were not in the castle at the time. This assassination attempt had nothing to do with you. Then Carter hesitated for a moment. Would you tell me, Your Highness, who prevented this assassination attempt? From what I saw at the scene, the knight gulped. They seem to have been killed by the same person, and they did not have even the slightest chance to fight back. You can decipher all that? Roland's curiosity was aroused. If the two sides were well matched in strength, the scene would not be so neat and clean, and there would have been all kinds of wounds on the assassinators' bodies. Carter said this in a low voice. But all the assassinators were lying on the floor of the warehouse. There was not a single broken item. On the huge boxes where we store meat, there's not even a trace of sword cuts. This means that the person who prevented this assassination attempt was able to move swiftly in a limited space without using any coverage. In my humble opinion, Your Highness, this is incredulous. I see. Roland nodded. He understood what Carter meant. In theory, even the strongest man on Earth would fall into a predicament if he was surrounded by enemies. Real battles were not comparable to movies or shows where the hero would fight one after another. Attacks from blind spots were most fatal. That's why, in a one-to-many situation, the correct countermeasure was to utilize the surrounding environment to face the enemies. However, Nightingale was not ordinary. No matter how, you shall do what you have to do. I won't reveal this individual's identity yet. I'll acknowledge you when the time comes. Even though the Chief Knight was loyal, dependable, and was aware of the fact that Anna and Nana were both witches, Roland still decided to conceal the existence of Nightingale for now. Different from the other two witches, Nightingale was not affiliated with Roland's party. She stayed in Border Town only for Anna. She was a member of the Witch Cooperation Association and would leave the town someday eventually. Carter left with apparent signs of disappointment on his face. Roland could understand his thoughts. As a swordsman who had been working to enhance his swordsmanship through learning the doctrines of his predecessors, he had always viewed those doctrines as the axioms of swordsmanship. He would naturally doubt himself when seeing such a disbelieving scene. If someone's swordsmanship could be exquisite to that extent, of what heritage was he so proud of? I thought you would have sold me out. Nightingale revealed herself. She was still sitting in the corner of the desk with her legs crossed. I thought so too. Why don't you just live here? Work as my shadow guard and you'll receive 2 gold royals every month, double the amount of Anna's pay. Would you consider my offer? Roland began. He pushed his enticement. You'll have a garden house, 2 days off per week. Every year, you'll have paid leaves. Well, I mean, you'll still get your salary on vacations. What surprised him was that this time Nightingale did not refuse immediately. She smiled and stated with firm determination, I can't leave my sisters behind. Then tell them to all come to the town. Once winter has ended, Border Town will be comprehensively renovated. The town will be able to fit as many residents as you could imagine. Also, witches will be able to walk in the streets without discrimination. No one will consider you folks as the wicked. Well, inform me once you have accomplished this. Nightingale shrugged. All right, so solicitation needed to be presented with the actual product. Roland diverted the subject. Nana has been safely escorted? Uh-huh, she was quite frightened. The prince sighed. It had been midnight when Nightingale woke him up. He nearly threw up after seeing the battle scene. She briefly accounted the things that had happened. Roland ordered her to get Nana secretly. The young girl who previously had only treated chickens almost fainted when she saw the soldier covered with blood. In order not to disturb Nana's family, Nightingale had to escort Nana back home as well. It was almost dawn when everything had finally been settled. What do you think about this incident? Would you be able to predict which of my dear brothers or sisters schemed this? Nightingale shook her head. They were all the members of the patrol team. The only exception did not carry any identification documents. Anyone could have hired those assassins. But I believe perhaps this assassination attempt has nothing to do with your siblings. How come? They were too careless. They went through internal conflicts for this one-time group mission. None of the assassins attempted suicide once the mission failed, leaving at least 2 of their members alive. Also at the time, they were not professional at all, almost like a street gang. That doesn't seem to be their usual behavior. It's more like a scheme plotted by amateurs. I believe even if I hadn't shown up, this assassination attempt wouldn't have had the slightest chance of success. Don't forget Anna was sleeping right downstairs. Nightingale picked up Roland's cup, took a sip nonchalantly, and continued, "Anyway, your knight is heading to the cell for interrogation as we speak. I bet soon enough he'll find out the truth. Compared to the tactics that your sister plotted, this guy is so much more inferior. He even begged me not to kill him. As for the heavily injured patrol leader, I seem to remember calling him in before." "Really?" Nightingale tilted her head. "I think you should sincerely applaud him. If he hadn't detained the other guys, I wouldn't have discovered those rats sneaking into the basement so quickly. I'm not sure why he did it, but an enemy's enemy is our friend, right?" "Right," Roland thought. However, his focus was not whether the patrol leader was a friend or a foe. It was the phrase that Nightingale had just used, "our friend." Chapter 32, The Night. When Brian woke up, the first thing he saw was the off-white ceiling. The dazzling sunlight shone through the window. Brian slightly closed his eyes and opened them again, but the glare of the sun remained unchanged. Brian thought. He tried to move his body but found that all he could do was to wag his fingers a little bit. Brian felt as if all his strength was drained. Then Brain heard someone call out, "He has awoken. Report to His Highness immediately." Brain felt his mind was in such a muddle that it was much duller than usual. Brian could vaguely remember that viper pierced through his chest. He felt so close to death, but a ghostly woman showed up at the very end and defeated all the enemies in an inconceivable way. Very soon, there came maids who assisted him to lean against the bed. Another maid brought a basin of water to clean his feet. Brian apparently had never experienced such a thorough service. Plus, they were all young maids, which made him felt quite helpless. Fortunately, such awkwardness did not last too long. When Prince Roland walked into the room, everyone bowed. Brian sensed his fervent heart pumping in his chest. Brian had too much to ask, but when he opened his mouth, he did not know where to begin. Instead, Roland nodded and said, "I've heard about your contributions, Brian. You're the well-deserved hero." Once the word hero was said, Brian felt a soreness in his eyes, and his voice even started to choke. "No, Your Highness, my mate is a real." Roland patted Brian on the shoulder to comfort him. Just like Nightingale's speculations, Fierce Scar divulged everything as soon as he was dragged into the interrogation room. The prison warden did not even need to work him over. The chief plotter of this group was not Roland's siblings. Instead, it was the Elk family from Longsong Stronghold. Earl of the Elk family contacted his distant relative Kills Med, which was Fierce Scar, and controlled a majority of the patrol team through enticement and segregation. Besides that, the Earl also replaced one of his elites into the patrol team as the insurance to prevent any accidents in his plan. The purpose of these people was not to kill Roland, but to burn all the storage food so that Roland would have to return to Longsong's stronghold. This conspiracy caused the death of an innocent member, Greyhound. He tried to stop the criminal plan of Fierce Scar's group, but he was killed by a patrol team member with a dagger. The whereabouts of patrol team member, which Viper replaced, was unclear. He probably escaped after he noticed that their scheme had failed since the castle did not catch fire and Fierce Scar did not promptly return either. Roland waited until Brian calmed his emotions and said, "Your friend Greyhound will receive a decent funeral. His family will also be properly taken care of so that his family shall not worry about food anymore." "Thank you, Your Highness." Brian took a deep breath. "May I ask whether Fierce Scar is dead?" "He's still alive for now." The patrol leader closed his eyes in agony. He would rather drag Fierce Scar into hell with him than be saved alone. His hope, however, had become almost impossible. Undoubtedly, Fierce Scar was guilty, but a crime by the noble could be lessened with monetary exchanges. Roland certainly noticed Brian's thoughts. Kills Med, or Fierce Scar in your tongue, is a member of the Elk family from Longsong's stronghold. The family is in the charge of Luke Med, an earl anointed by Duke Ryan, and also Fierce Scar's distant uncle. Roland paused for a moment. "But all of these shall not affect the final jurisdiction, and Fierce Scar has been sentenced to death by hanging. He'll be executed in 3 days. If you're recovered by that time, you could probably take a look." Brian suddenly opened his eyes wide. But Your Highness, the noble could be atoned with gold royals. Your jurisdiction will probably infuriate the Roland waved his hands, and gestured Brian to compose himself. "The noble? Perhaps for you guys, Fierce Scar who was born in the Elk family hold the social status that was distinctly different from yours. But in fact, he's hardly a noble, for he has neither title nor lands. Besides, even if he's a noble, there's no way to spare his life for what he has done, intruding the quarter of the prince, attempting to burn down the grains and disregarding the life of over 2,000 people living in Border Town." Roland had a bit of hesitation when he ordered death sentence to Tyre. But Fierce Scar will definitely not be excused from his wrongdoings. If Fierce Scar's plan had succeeded, Roland's foundation in Border Town would be destroyed. Roland would have no chance to turn the situation around. This was even more abominable than killing Roland. Would his jurisdiction infuriate Longsong's stronghold? Who cared? Since the Earl was unwilling to have peaceful business transactions with Roland and decided to harm Border Town, Roland would not give in for sure. This assassination attempt also gave Roland a warning. The political struggles in this world were far different from that of Roland's former world. In Roland's former world, the political leaders preferred to keep the fights in the shade. In this world, people were more inclined to confront one another. "Rest well. You lost too much blood, so you'd better not leave the castle. I've assigned your work in the patrol team to someone else. I'll hold the canonization ceremony for you after the months of demons ends." "Your Highness." After hearing the last sentence, Brian looked at the prince incredulously. "You mean, yes, you'll be my knight, Mr. Brian," Roland answered with a smile. "Ready, stab." Van single quotier thrust out his long wooden pole, using the same strength from last time and also a similar angle. This was the 100th time that he thrust out his wooden pole. His arms turning sore, Van Single-Cotillard thought that he would not be able to stand such exercise anymore. Even though he already felt like that when he thrust out his weapon for the 50th time, but the conditioned reflex after a week's training made him obey the order. Van Single-Cotillard himself was surprised that he was able to go this far. Everyone, rest. The moment when Iron Axe called out the instruction, he heard heavy breathing from all around him. Van Single-Cotillard was relieved too. He put down his pole and slumped down onto the ground. Until now, Van Single-Cotillard finally understood that the militia to which he belonged was not an insignificant troop that was only responsible for running errands for soldiers or knights. After a week's peculiar training, their training mission became more and more official. Like now, they were standing upon the city wall thrusting out and withdrawing their spears. Although these spears were replaced with wooden poles, Van Single-Cotillard soon understood his role and responsibility in his troop. Logistics team would never do such training. This means that Van Single-Cotillard and the other members would actually confront and fight against the demonic beasts on the city wall. It was such a frightening thought. Van Single-Cotillard originally planned to sneak away, but after seeing the other members who went through the same training with him, and also thinking about the palatable meals and lucrative salary, Van Single-Cotillard could not make the decision. Chapter 33. The Gunpowder. Everyone stands up. Prince Roland is coming. They had not rested for 15 minutes when Iron Axe clapped and yelled. Van Single-Cotillard soon returned to his position. The previous special training caused him to have reflexes towards conforming commands. Almost subconsciously, he held up his wooden pole and assembled himself in the preparation posture for thrusting. Prince Roland and his retinues walked upon the city wall and passed the troop from behind. Through the corner of his eyes, Van Single-Cotillard noticed that His Highness slowed down when passing himself. Roland groaned in his heart. It was truly the axiom that getting up late will ruin your morning, while getting up early will ruin your whole day. He just finished dealing with the aftermath of the raid on the castle, and then he had to come to inspect the recent training results of the militia. The poor guy did not sleep all night, and now he was sleepy. But he had to come, for the team had been in the training stage. As the commander, his prolonged absence would lead to a diminished sense of existence and the morale of his team would also become unstable. Roland pondered for a moment. "Hi, comrades. Good job, comrades." If nobody responded, it would be very awkward after I called out that phrase. Or perhaps it'll be better to have casual conversations with someone. That would help me to express my kindness and also raise my reputation. He thought to implement his plan and patted a muscular young fellow on the back. "You were laborious. Did you feel tired? Did you like the meals?" Depended on the past experiences from reading the news, Roland was expecting the young fellow to answer his questions with a loud and excited response such as "Not tired at all, I feel excellent." However, the young fellow was so excited that he immediately knelt down on his knee after he turned to Roland, which surprised Roland quite a bit. Van Single-Cotillard felt that he was being blessed by the heaven that Prince Roland was asking him if he was tired with the training in such a kind tone. Not to mention the royal family, even the ordinary nobles were normally reluctant to talk to plebeians. Almost by reflex, he imitated knight's salutation to honor Prince Roland. He did not care whether if he was appropriate to do such practice. Van Single-Cotillard only had one thought in his mind, that after he returned to his hometown, he would be regarded as a substantial figure. Van Single-Cotillard felt the chaos in his mind after Roland asked him to stand up. Van Single-TR could not even remember how he replied to Roland's questions. At last, His Highness asked if Van Single-TR had any opinions about the training. Van Single-TR suddenly cleared his head. This is a great opportunity. If I could make Your Highness believe that the militia alone wouldn't be able to bear the responsibility of defending the city walls, then perhaps I won't need to worry about whether to stay or sneak away. He carefully cogitated his word choice. Your Honorable Highness, the number of the members of the militia is small. If we continue the current alignment training method, when the demonic beasts attack, we at most can only defend 1/3 of the city wall. Will you consider even if Prince Roland recruited more members, there would not be enough time for training, Van Single-TR thought. Besides, there would be a huge expense for their weapons. It would be arduous to gather enough spears for 300 members within 2 months in Border Town. It would be difficult to assemble even 100 spears, therefore, they were still training with wooden rods. If Prince Roland could realize that, then perhaps he would recruit mercenary from other towns as the primary defense force. At least the mercenary would be able to go on the battlefield without training. They would have their own weapons and armors, except that the price would be a bit high. Roland pondered for a moment and nodded. You have good points. It's unrealistic to have the militia alone guard the entire city wall. Van Single-TR felt delighted. His Highness meant to agree with his thoughts? However, Prince Roland did not say what Van Single-TR was expecting to hear. Instead, he called Iron Axe. In a sense, demonic beasts are just mutated beasts, and that they don't have the ability to think, right? Yes, Your Highness. The normal demonic beasts are no different from those wild beasts, and even their habits are almost the same as for the demonic hybrids. I haven't seen many, so I'm not sure. That'll be okay. Even though it's almost 600 meters from the Redwater River to the foot of North Slope Mountain, we can lure the demonic beasts to attack the specific areas. You mean setting up traps? Iron Axe asked. It's a trap, but not the kind that hunters would typically use. Standard traps capture prey by concealing themselves. Well, I want to do the opposite. I'll set up roadblocks from places far away from the city wall, such as fences, earth slopes, ditches to force the unintelligent demonic beasts to detour. The continuous roadblocks will lead the prey to assigned locations, and at the end gather at the defense area that we prepared. Roland looked at the Iron Axe. As for how to lure those beasts, I think no one knows better than you do. Iron Axe thought for a moment. It'll be fine to guide then, and demonic wolves don't like water, demonic boars are afraid of light, and all the other demonic beasts have their own habits. But Your Highness, in this way, we'll have all the demonic beasts gathered within this area of 600 feet. Wouldn't that be too dangerous? It's true if we only have spears and arrows as the weapon, Roland said confidently, but now, we have a new weapon. When it was about the time to leave, the prince once again came to Van Single-TR and patted on his shoulder. You have a good observation. What's your name? Van Single-TR, Your Highness. I'll propose to my chief knight to appoint you as the deputy force commander of the spear squad. Mr. Van Single-TR, I'm looking forward to seeing your more achievements. Roland built a flat house in the yard of the firing room to produce snow powder, in other words, the gunpowder. This 300 square meter house only had one entrance and was heavily guarded. There were 2 knights guarding the entrance. To prevent anyone from bringing flammables to the room, all visitors were required to register and go through the security check. This is the new weapon that you talked about? Carter, who was summoned by Roland, pinched the black powder with his fingers, and sniffed it. "Isn't it the snow powder?" Perhaps Ironax did not know, but Carter often attended the royal ceremonies, and of course, he knew that snow powder was something that people place in the ceremonial barrels. It was the proudest production of the alchemical workshop, and its prescription was a confidentiality to outsiders. However, the prince could get whatever he wanted. "It's snow power, but not entirely the same," Roland said, "and it's the newest modified product of the alchemical workshop. I call it the gunpowder." Gunpowder was known as the secret weapon for mass production. Its ingredients were easily accessible. The prescription required 3 ingredients: sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. Gunpowder would be made by just mixing these 3 ingredients at a 1:1:5:7.5 ratio. It could be easily produced without any technical barriers. The snow powder in this age consisted of 60% of charcoal, 20% of sulfur and saltpeter, and 20% of other bizarre, inferior ingredients. It could not function as gunpowder due to its slow combustion speed and insufficient gas release. However, Roland knew that the alchemists were trying to test other prescriptions. In at most 30 years, a prescription similar to the standard gunpowder prescription would be developed. In history, after the invention of gunpowder, it still took a long time for people to forego the usage of cold weapons. The reason rooted in the prescription of gunpowder and also the stagnation of the related armament manufacture industry. However, many people overlooked the fact that gunpowder itself could be an extremely formidable weapon even without relying on firearms. Chapter 34. The trial. Blasting. Right when the firing room for cement was built, Roland had already assigned labs for the several follow-up projects. Most of the labs were being built around the North Slope mine area so that the labs could be efficiently guarded. The construction of the labs was speedy due to their simple composition of adobe walls and wooden roofs. And their construction would not intervene with the construction of the city wall. The saltpeter purchased from Willowtown was delivered to the nearby warehouse to be stored. It would be ground, measured, and sent to the labs when it was time to use them. Charcoal and sulfur would go through the same process. The transport and mixture of the 3 ingredients would be completed by different groups of people. This way, Roland could eliminate the risk of the plan being leaked out. Roland took 20 pounds from the pre-made gunpowder, and slowly poured it onto a cropped sheepskin. The gunpowder all went through the process of soaking, compressing, drying, grinding, and screening. They were all in similar sizes and extremely inflammable. To prevent any accidents due to the collision of sparks, the entire manufacturing process did not use any metal products. Instead, they used ceramics or wooden products. After pouring the gunpowder, Roland folded the sheepskin to 3 folds and tied it with string. "That's all I need to do?" Carter asked. This object in front of him could also be called a weapon. Although it was the modified version of the snow powder, it would not do any damage just by its loud noise. Perhaps it would be effective to farmers who had never been to the battlefield, but it certainly would not frighten the trained soldiers and mercenaries. However, the chief knight pondered cautiously. Although the things that His Highness had been doing seemed unreasonable, they all turned out to be extremely efficient. If the demonic beasts had similar intelligence to ordinary beasts, perhaps this gunpowder thing would actually work? For example, a sudden loud noise could make them flee and startle. That way, the stress on the troop could be lessened. Roland gave the wrapped-up gunpowder to Carter and took a bag of the inflammable gunpowder that had been ground. "It's almost the time, let's head to the outside of the city wall. Iron Axe should already be prepared." About 2 miles from the city wall to the west, the vacant space between misty forest and the impassable mountain range would be the area to do the trial blasting. Iron Axe and the other hunters had already been waiting here for a long time. Besides Iron Axe, everyone was local and also the ones with the best archery skills. Hearing that Prince Roland had a mission to assign them, they immediately followed Iron Axe over. Everyone knew now that the new Lord of Border Town was generous about giving remunerations. Following Roland's command, they set up long wooden poles on the four corners, tied up strings, and enclosed a watch circle for half of a mile. Roland assigned knights to scout near the city wall in case anyone approached by accident. Roland examined around the watch circle, and nodded. "Did you bring all the praise?" "Your Highness, the praise are here." Iron Axe came up with a cage. Carter noticed the hens and rabbits in the cage. "Very well, put them on 5 steps, 10 steps, 15 steps, and 30 steps away from the center, and tie one on every wooden pole." Carter shook his head and suggested, "Your Highness, I'm afraid the praise you selected could hardly have any test effect. These animals are timid by nature. They will flee if there are any noises nearby. Even if the noise could scare them, but it wouldn't be able to startle the demonic beasts." "To startle the demonic beasts?" Roland paused for one moment and realized. "I'm not planning to scare them, even though this thing is astonishing when it explodes." Roland brought the chief knight to the center of the circle, dropped off a bag of gunpowder, and tore an opening in the bag to allow some powder to leak out. Then Roland pulled out the leather bag with gunpowder, and continued to sprinkle the gunpowder from the opening while stepping backward. It was a windless day, perfect for such a primordial explosive method. Roland retrieved the leather bag only when they retreated to 100 meters away. "That's enough, let's ignite it here." He repeatedly estimated the distance, making sure it was auroraless, and then said to Carter, "Bring all the hunters here." At this moment, Roland was quite excited. He had done a smaller scale of the explosion test, so he was not that concerned with the outcome of the experiment. What he really cared about was that this moment would be a moment of great invention. The thermal weapon would officially step on the stage, and Roland would be recorded into history as the chief leader. After everyone gathered, Roland ignited the gunpowder. Carter lay on the ground. He felt uneasy as he watched the spark furthering away. With such a long distance, plus it was not even put in the bronze barrel, the exploding noise of snow powder might not even be reached here. It was unnecessary for Prince Roland to demand that everyone had to lie on the ground. However, there was nothing left to say since Prince Roland took the lead himself. The ground was freezing cold during winter. Carter could felt the chill even if he was wearing chain armor. Carter moved a bit. An astonishingly loud sound broke out as he was about to lie on his side. Because the distance was too close, the exploding noise and the shock arrived at the same time. He felt a sudden buzzing in his ears and the world became quiet. The shaking of the ground continued momentarily. He lifted up his head and saw a black cloud rising into the air, followed by the falling of stones and mud. The shock that Roland received was much less than the chief knight's. As someone that would cover his ears even for firecrackers, Roland promptly prepared protection for himself. The explosive point was unlike in movies, where there would be huge fireballs. The glaring light of flame flashed, multitudes of mud were blasted off the ground, reaching a height of 10 meters in the air. When everything settled down, the only thing that Roland felt was this noise was much louder than firecrackers. Regarding Iron Axe and the other hunters, they were flabbergasted by what they just saw and heard. Only Iron Axe knew that this experiment was to test a new weapon, but he also did not expect the momentum of the weapon to be so groundbreaking. Only the thunder of God's punishment could be comparable to this. Roland stood up. He led the group to the center of the explosion. There was a half-meter deep hole on the ground. The bunny that was closest to the center had utterly disappeared, leaving only a short stake on the ground. Roland examined every other prey. The hens that were placed on the 10-step point and 15-step point were lying on the ground, apparently dead. Although there were no physical damages on them, Roland knew that they died of the shock from the explosion. The only survivor was the gray bunny that was placed on the 30-step point. There were drops of blood from its ear, and it even gave up struggling when people walked near it. It seemed like that the massive blast of the explosion had deprived its soul. Carter swallowed. The buzzing in his ears was gradually recovering. Until now, he finally understood what Prince Roland meant by not planning to scare them away. Was that the outcome of the modification of snow powder? With such accomplishment, the power of alchemists would be much superior to the power of astrologers. The way Iron Axe looked at Roland had changed. Your Highness, if the militia could utilize such a weapon, then Border Town would no longer be threatened by the demonic beasts. Could this weapon be mass-produced? Roland shrugged. Probably not. We would only be able to produce 20 to 30 of them before the months of demons. The key issue was the saltpeter. The manufacture in this age was still quite primordial. The only way of manufacturing was to collect the nitric acid crystals separated out by the lime mixture of human and livestock waste. Other than the alchemists and the upper nobles that had a demand, there was almost no other uses. So there were few refining fields. If they were all used to do explosives, they would soon be exhausted. As the ultimate weapon, it had to be used along with flintlock and crossbow bolts. Chapter 35, The Home. Nightingale walked in the mist. In it, she could see the world had only two colors, black and white. The outline of all things turned vague, and the lines that used to be straight were folded and curved, as incomprehensible and abstract as doodles painted by children. The feeling was hard to get a sense of, and it took her a long time to distinguish the different types of lines. If she handled them well, there was nothing that would restrain her, and she could travel unimpeded in the mist. Though the walls seemed to link up into one stretch, with a little change of the angle, she could see a gate to the real world, a gate that never existed in reality. In the mist, the concepts of up, down, forward, and backward were not consistent, and they would shift and even overlap. Now she did this again and sneaked into the castle under guards' noses, following the changeable lines. Step by step through the void, she went through the ceiling and entered Anna's chamber. For Nightingale, it was an absolutely free world. The mist was the only place where she truly felt at peace. Quiet and lonely as it may be, she enjoyed the safe, unthreatened feeling it gave her. Mostly, it was black and white, but sometimes she could see other colors. Such as the color of Anna, who was in front of her. Different from ordinary people, the witches were an aggregate of magic power which was the only color in the mist, and Nightingale could see how the power flowed and faded. However, she had never seen colors as strong and rich as Anna's. There was a dark green light glittering on her that led to a dazzling bright white core. Nightingale was confused. Generally, the color of magic power was connected to the owner's performance of ability, and for the witches that she knew in the Witch Cooperation Association who had the power to control fire, the light that shone out of them was dark red or orange and shaped like a fireball. Whether in size or radiance of light, Anna's fire was far above theirs. In addition, There was something even more miraculous. How was she still alive with so much powerful energy converging on her? Of all the witches in the Witch Cooperation Association, no one had power as strong as Anna, not even the adults. And when Anna became an adult, Nightingale sighed. She knew that Anna no longer had any hope. The bite grew with power, and she was afraid to even imagine what horror would come to Anna when the demonic torture began. She knew the feeling too well. From your skin to your guts, the constant sharp pain tore at you, keeping you conscious until the moment you gave up and accepted death. Stepping out from the mist, she restrained the depressed mood and braced herself up, greeting, "Good morning, Anna." Anna, who had been used to Nightingale's abrupt and uninvited visits, nodded. She did not reply but continued practicing with her fire. Rubbing her nose, Nightingale headed to the girl's bed and sat down. She had seen Anna practice many times, from the beginning when she set fire to her own robes accidentally and had prepared a full bucket of robes in a shed in the backyard garden till later when she could easily make the flame dance on her fingertip, and Roland had to dismiss the supervision and take down the shed to make room for afternoon tea and sunbath. Even so, Anna still followed the old instruction of Roland and kept practicing 2 or 4 hours every day in her own chamber. "I've brought some fish cake, do you want some?" Nightingale took out a little bag and unfolded it, handing it over. Anna smelled it and nodded. "Go and wash your hands." Nightingale smiled, feeling lucky that Anna did not hate her but was simply bad at talking. In fact, Anna barely even talked to Nana, who she cared about so much. She scarcely talked to anyone except Roland. In contrast, Roland talked too much of his endless principles. Even for dinners, he had many rules, like washing hands before eating, eating slowly, and never putting anything that dropped on the floor into your mouth, etc. He could go on and on about every principle. Though Roland's sermon sounded annoyed at her at first, she had to listen and obey because Roland, the 4th Prince of Greycastle and the Lord of this land, had accommodated her under his roof. Now, she actually formed those habits and somehow felt a sense of odd fun when competing with Roland and Nana to be the first one to wash hands. Anna washed her hands in a pail and lit a little fire to dry them before she pinched a fish cake and returned to her table and ate it slowly. "Did you really make up your mind not to return with me?" said Nightingale, trying to start a conversation. "We have a lot of sisters there and they would take care of you. Over here, the castle is the only place you can stroll and roam. It's quite boring, isn't it? Indeed, we don't have much food or goods, but we're a family having joined together for the same purpose. A girl like you who has such power will be most welcome. I'm afraid that you'll not make it through this winter." Nightingale's voice lowered. Maybe it's too late, she thought. Even if she went back to the camp, Anna's power was so strong that she would never survive the adulthood. All Nightingale could do was to watch her die. "Where did you live before joining the Witch Cooperation Association?" Anna asked. Nightingale waited for a little while, for Anna barely asked her anything. "I used to live in a big city in the east, near the capital." "Were you happy?" "Happy? No. It was a piece of memory she would never recall. It was when she had to depend on others for a living, being despised and mocked. And things turned worse when she found out she was a witch. She was watched and chained around the neck, just like a cat or dog, forced to follow their commands." Nightingale shook her head and asked softly, "Why are you asking?" "I used to live in the old district." Anna briefly went through her story. "My father sold me for 25 gold royals to the church. It was His Highness who released me. I'm very happy here. But you cannot get out of this castle. Except for Roland Wimbledon, Everyone still hates witches. I don't really care about it, and he promised that he would change them all, didn't he? As long as the church stands, witches will always be treated as evil, and that will make the change extremely difficult. Anna did not contradict her and was quiet for so long that Nightingale thought she would never speak again. Then she asked suddenly, "What place makes you happier to live in, the Witch Cooperation Association or here?" The question caught Nightingale unprepared, and she was flustered. What are you talking about?" "Oh, of course, it's the Witch Cooperation Association." Honestly, she did not have much interest in searching Holy Mountain, but in the association, she had some friends who she would never leave behind. Border town? She would not have been here if she hadn't heard the news of endangered witches. The answer was obvious, so why was she hesitating? This time, a smile appeared on Anna's face, the smile that Nightingale had hardly seen. Her eyes were as clear as water and the lake twinkling in the early sun, and brought her a feeling of odd relief, even though she did not walk in the mist. "Roland used to tell me that you girls are looking for the Holy Mountain among the northern mountains, and I found mine if it's the safe and home that you want to find there." Nightingale realized Border Town was Anna's holy mountain. However, death was coming upon her, and her spirit would approach the next world earlier than most witches. There were hurried footsteps outside the door. Listening carefully, Nightingale figured out it was from Nana. The door was flung open before Nana dashed in. She ran into Anna's arms, weeping, and said, "Anna, my sister, what should I do? My father has found out I'm a witch." Chapter 36, The Negotiation. Roland was dragged out of bed by Nightingale. He was taken aback when hearing the news that Nana Pine's father was waiting for him in the hall. But he realized it was a good opportunity. In order to have the girls' support in the fight against the months of demons, he must persuade the Pines to spend winter in Border Town. It had been a tricky situation for Prince Roland, as his reputation and popularity had hit rock bottom among the noble. Even his relations with Longsong's stronghold had turned strained. He would not stand a chance to keep the nobles at Border Town in winter, as their business lay mostly in the east of Longsong's stronghold. From the very beginning, Roland had not thought of cooperating with the nobles, who were good at winning power and possessions, rather than fighting side by side. He got dressed quickly and briefly cleaned himself, before heading to the hall. Being left alone for so long that he could no longer hide his rage, Pine stood up and asked as soon as he saw the prince, "Your Highness, where's my daughter?" This was the first time Roland saw Nana's father. He was strong and sturdy, not very tall, and had a thick beard that made him tough-looking. From his attire of the waisted cotton garment and leather pant attached with big pockets, he looked like more a huntsman than a noble. "She's fine, Mr. Pine." "Why did your guards let her in but yet bar me outside?" Tigui interrupted loudly. "I need an explanation, Your Highness. Please take my daughter to see me." Roland did not expect this and got stunned for a little while. He had pictured the scene that a father, who knew that his poor daughter was a witch, would beg his prince to hide the news, or ask him for help to deal with the problem. However, a father who was so pushy and discourteous without his noble manner, did surprise Roland. Certainly, he knew why the guards allowed Nana in, for they were under his command. They became familiar with Nana, who had been coming here for Anna from time to time. After a moment's thought, he summoned the maid to take Nana here. However rude he is, Tigui Pine is Nana's father. Let's see what'll happen when they meet each other. If he has any plans to send the girl to the church or abandon her, I'll intervene and take action, Roland thought. Following Anna, Nana stepped in the chamber. Seeing his daughter, Tigui Pine's anger died away at once. He opened his arms and called Nana, "Come here, my daughter." The young girl did not move. Hiding behind Anna, she popped out half a head and asked, "Will you sell me to the church?" "Nonsense, what are you talking about? Silly girl, the church doesn't want a girl as silly as you. Come home with me now." Roland was confused about what was happening. Nightingale told him that after Nana's father bumped into her when she was doing magic, she ran to the castle for Anna in panic. Her father was after her, his face murderous. But all he could see from Tigui was how he cared about and loved his daughter, unlike ordinary people who loathed the witches. Roland hesitated for a little while and decided to be frank. "Mr. Pine, I believe you've already known that your daughter is a witch." "Pardon me, Your Highness, I don't understand," said Tigui, as he stepped over and tried to grasp Nana's hand, but was blocked by Anna. "Father, I'm a witch now, sorry," Nana whispered. Tigui became anxious and said, "Nonsense. Witch. Must be the teachings from the damn guy Carl. I shouldn't have sent you to the school because what you've learned is nothing but bullshit." These words hit Roland's mind, and he realized that all the concealing Tigui had done for Nana might be due to his misunderstanding of him. Therefore, he was so anxious and worried before seeing Nana. "Anna." He winked at the witch, and she nodded. She reached out her right hand to Tigui, who tried to bypass Anna and get Nana. Fire burst from her palm, flying past his top. Tigui's eyes widened, flustering backward to dodge the fire. Nana held Anna's arm in alarm. "Sister Anna." "No, Your Highness, what's?" "As you see, she is also a witch, like your daughter." Roland extended his hand and said, "Maybe you've misunderstood the reason why Nana is free to walk in the castle. Shall we have a real talk now?" Tigui seemed awakened. "Ha. Ha," he said, "Your Highness, take a seat." Roland pointed to the table and said, "Let's begin our talk with some nice tea." He sighed secretly. "Now I see how notorious my reputation is. They even think I'll put my claw on little girls. Now, I've understood everything from Tigui's ungracious behavior. What will a father, who loves his daughter so much, think when he sees his girl running into the castle where the guards are accustomed to her? If I'm the father, I'll bring down the castle on my own." The words Tigui used to cover up the truth that his daughter was a witch had proved all things clearly, worrying that the prince would threaten him with some excuse that Nana had fallen into depravity, and only cleansing could save her. He personally did not care much about whether his baby daughter was a witch or not. Tigui hesitated for a long while before taking the seat. He drank up a cup of tea, dried his lips with his sleeves, looked awkward, and said, "My apologies, I've been rude. Please tell me, when did you know my daughter was a witch?" "It was before winter, and it was not me but her teacher Carl van Bate who found her awakened. He entrusted me to protect Nana because of Anna, his friend." Roland explained explicitly. "In this half-month, she came to the castle to practice her power when she was available. By the way, she has the power to heal." "Has she?" Tigui scratched his head and said, "That was why the cat started to run and skip again." "Cat? Nothing special. When I came back home, I found her sitting on porch and carrying a cat wounded by a carriage. I was about to scare her from her back, but when she spotted me, she ran away immediately. The cat had broken legs, but suddenly it recovered." He gazed at Nana and Anna and asked, "You two are friends?" Nana nodded quickly before Anna could make any response. Tigui's face turned gentle. Seeing this, Roland asked, It seems that you don't trust the rumor that the witches are the evils seduced by the demon. Certainly, my daughter is no evil, he said firmly, and whatever she turns into, there's no doubt about that. Roland was touched by Nana's father, who was much different from Nana's father. He finally understood the reason why Nana was always so sweet and innocent, wearing a smile on her face almost every day. This family was like a warm cradle for a kid to grow up in. I have no doubt either, Mr. Pine. The prince was straightforward. Your daughter has a marvelous power to heal the wounded. I hope she'll stay in Border Town, assisting me to fight through the months of demons. Tigui was indecisive. Your Highness, forgive me, I have no choice but to refuse. When the months of demons come, Border Town will be deadly dangerous, and I'd never allow her to stay in danger. Still, Roland believed that nothing was impossible when they were willing to sit down and talk. Chapter 37, Tigui Pine's family history. Danger is relative, Mr. Pine, yet opportunity comes with danger, Roland said, as he read over the relevant materials collected by his assistant minister in his mind. You inherited the title from your father, am I right? He had been a knight and was rewarded the name and land for his valor in battle. Exactly, Tigui said, nodding. The battle also started in the months of demons, and it was an honorable battle fought for the innocent. At that time, a small number of demonic beasts accidentally crossed our stronghold defense through the Redwater River into the hinterland of the western region. Your father came across those beasts when he was in his patrol duty. Considering that the town behind him had no fortifications, though it was not in his governance, he chose to attack the beasts. Rather than avoiding and retreating for support, which most men would have done under the same circumstances, Roland stated, watching Tigui. I believe you're clearer about what happened afterward than me. Together with the men who he gathered in town and his squire, your father marched on the beasts and defeated them. Indeed, Tigui said, his voice trembled with excitement, apparently admiring this glorious history. One of the monsters, dreadfully huge, looked like either a stage or an ox or the combination of both. Its leg was thicker and sturdier than my father's trunk and shook the ground when it ran. I could never defeat this kind of monster if I were there. But he did it. Standing near a shallow groove, my father lured the angry beast to him, and when it sped up to strike, he lay down in the shallow groove, holding the sword on a stone with the tip right up. The seemingly invincible beast was too foolish to dodge the sword tip, which ripped open its belly, and the guts poured out, covering all over my father. By now, above my hearth still hangs the reward from that battle, a large horn from a demonic beast. Roland drank some tea and said calmly, the battle was worthy of admiration. Your father had kept his faith, compassion, and bravery of a knight. Joe Cole, who gave your father the title and the land, was an earl in Longsong stronghold back then. 25 years ago, he was promoted to a duke by my father, King Wimbledon III. He was appointed as the guardian of the southern border, with his governance extending all over the southern territory. It was a pity that with no one staying in Longsong stronghold to back the late Pine. After Joe Cole had received the new appointment, he became a thorn in the eyes of the Duke of Long's stronghold, when he stayed at the east of Longsong stronghold. You know it all too well. Tigui exhaled, looking a little helpless. Lord Joe doesn't get along well with Duke of Longsong stronghold and didn't obtain his earl's title from the Duke, either. With a bloodline tracing back to the branch of the crown, he's not beneath Duke Ryan, whether by family or blood. This is politics, Roland thought secretly, a trick played by King Wimbledon III that would balance two powers. In order to fully understand the complicated relations between these two families, he had spent a whole day with his assistant minister. The lands and governance among the noble are extremely complicated. In theory, the superiors were able to command juniors within his land. But it turns out that was far more complex to carry out. As we could see from Joe Cole and Duke Ryan, though having his land in the western region, Joe Cole, who was an earl named directly by the king, was as respected and beloved as Duke Ryan by the subjects. After Joe had been titled the Duke of the Southern Territory, the crown would surely arrange new spies on his land, which was the usual means to keep political stability. Therefore, when the land was passed to you, the trade and farm had turned bad gradually, and the property was no longer as prosperous as it had been, Roland said slowly. Now, here is a new chance for you. A new chance? I suppose you heard the famine that happened 2 years ago. Longsong's stronghold detained the food supply of the next month in the name of insufficient ores trading. This year we have the same trouble. The unexpected collapse that happened in the mine of Northern Slope has backed my people into a corner, and we have to ward off demonic beasts with the help of our newly built city wall. The war will be tough and hard, but yet chances come with danger, as I said before. Tigui knew what the prince meant. He frowned and said nothing. It seems to me that you're not a general noble. Roland smiled. For no nobles dress like you when they're out and no highborns get their palms full of horns. Mr. Pine, you haven't left behind your father's legacy, have you? The fighting skill of a knight. It was certain that he did not leave behind the skill, Roland thought, or he would never spend so much time on the misty forest. From the information offered by Baroff, he spent at least 3 days every week in the misty forest during his days in Border Town. Each time he was fully equipped and brought hunters with him because he could not afford to keep squires. Some people liked fighting and apparently, Tigui Pine was one of them. I'll offer you this chance to win back the honor of your father, to fight for them with your sword and courage. I'll reward you a piece of land in the east of Border Town, an appropriate piece of land for the Viscount if you're doing well in battle. Though it rarely happened, the offer was valid. When a prince had come of age, he had the power to name the Viscount, Baron, and Knight according to law. However, he barely did it to the men who were under other lords' authorities. He was afraid of either being inappropriate to poach from other lords or being awkward to be rejected. But in Roland's eyes, manners meant nothing compared to Nana's healing skill, neither did he worry about being rejected by Mr. Pine. Since Joe did not bring Tigui's father with him when he was the guardian of the southern border, it seemed that Joe had given up the Pines. Finally, Tigui said, "Your Highness, may I send Nana back to Longsong's stronghold? No one has ever defeated the demonic beasts here, and I don't want my daughter to perish here in case we lose the battle. I've told you from the very beginning, Mr. Pine, that the danger is relative. Have you ever thought what if anyone in Longsong's stronghold finds out Nana is a witch? Unlike here, the church has its root deep and long in Longsong's stronghold. With disciples and spies everywhere, I can't even save her, once her identity is revealed." Roland paused for a moment and added, "Border Town will not fall, for I'll fight with my people side by side on the city wall when the months of demons comes. Our enemies are mutated beasts, not unbeatable demons. You father defeated them on a plain without any cover, and we have more now. An unsurpassable wall that stands between the beasts and us. If we're truly in danger, I'll send Nana away to secure her safety." He paused. "And Anna, too. I'll prepare a boat on the dock in case. I promise they'll be safe." "Then I lay my trust on you, Your Highness," said Tigui Pine, And he stood up and kneeled, his chest straight up and his belly flat, before he saluted the prince with a knight courtesy and pledged, "I'll fight for you." After Tigui and Nana had taken their leave, Anna rolled her eyes to Roland. "What are you dreaming of?" she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Chapter 38, The Era of Firearms. Iron Axe knew that he was under surveillance. The hunters involved in the trial blasting were gathered in a two-story building near the castle. Looking through the window, one could see the stone walls enveloping the castle and the guards stationed at the entrance. It didn't bother him. Rather, he felt that it was reckless for His Highness to send only 2 guards to watch over them. Even now, the roar of the trial blasting echoed in his mind. There had never been a weapon that left him in so much shock. In the southernmost land, he had witnessed orange fire erupting from within the earth, which burnt for decades. He had also seen the monstrous winds and waves at the endless cape. However, those were the immeasurable prestige of the heavens, the will of the Mother Earth or the sea god, as well as the iron whip of the deities used to punish all creatures. Yet His Highness alone had usurped the power of the 3 gods and obtained God's strength to punish all creatures. His power was still lacking compared to the heavens' thunderbolts, but it was already in a realm untouchable by mere humans. If the participants in Iron Sum City proved to be still useful, their tongues would generally be cut off. Of course, that was not the safest practice to keep their secrets. Only the dead would carry their secrets to grave. As for the foreigners, even just the sight of them was considered blasphemy. It was impossible for any of them to assimilate into the core class of the Mojin clan. Even though the prince was aware that he was from a different race, he still allowed him to witness the fire of God's punishment. The prince even intended for him to form the hunter squad. His trust roused Iron Axe's spirits and set his blood boiling. After being betrayed and framed countless times in Iron Sum City, he fled to the southern territory in the Kingdom of Grey Castle. But he still suffered discrimination there due to his mixed blood of Summed Nation and Grey Castle Nation people. Dispirited, he came to Border Town with the intention to work as a hunter for the rest of his life. Yet he unexpectedly won the prince's favor here. He had no doubts that this new weapon would pave the way for Roland Wimbledon's victory in the selection of Crown Prince. Iron Axe was thrilled to know that he would have an opportunity to serve the future king. Everyone, gather downstairs. Hearing the shout, Iron Axe looked out. The voice belonged to Carter Lannis, Prince Roland's chief knight. He finished dressing up and hurried downstairs. He walked towards Carter and stood upright in front of him. He had participated in the training of the militia, so he knew that His Highness favored disciplined and well-organized troops. The other hunters, however, were much slower. The 6 people spent about half a quarter just to line up. The same old place. "Follow me." Unconcerned, Carter headed straight to the city wall with everyone. It was the same site for the trial blasting, but without cordons this time. Other than Roland, there were 4 knights with him. All of them Carter's subordinates. Iron Axe noticed that the prince was fiddling with an oddly shaped long metal stick as he explained something to the knights. Noticing the arrival of Iron Axe and the others, Roland approached them and asked, "Have you all got used to living in your new place?" "Thank you for your concern, Your Highness." Everyone bowed and answered that their new houses were very comfortable. Iron Axe thought that the new houses were much better than the old ones. At least, they did not leak. The roofs were not covered with thin straw blankets, but neatly lined with tiles instead. "That's great." Roland nodded and added, "The current arrangement is for security reasons. You can return to your old houses after the months of demons ends. I've also distributed your first month's salaries to your families." You can meet them on weekends, accompanied by guards of course. Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness. The hunter's replies were cheerful. This came as a surprise to Iron Axe. Never mind the law of Sand Nation, even the military management of the Kingdom of Greycastle should not be this lax. Was this His Highness's benevolence towards them? He became a little worried. If the prince wanted to fight for the throne, he must be merciless. That Iron Axe knew all too well, having lived in Iron Summed City. However, when Prince Roland said that they would test a new weapon based on gunpowder next, Iron Axe immediately threw his worries behind. He stared without blinking at the prince as he showed them two oddly shaped iron sticks. "They're called flintlocks," said Roland. "I'll tell you how to use them next." It took Iron Axe only half an hour to learn how to use the new weapons. Put gunpowder, that was, the black powder which would cause the fire of God's punishment, into the barrel, put a lead pill, and poke it until it reached the end. Then pour the gunpowder into the flash pan at the rear, aim at the target, and pull the trigger. He believed he had a talent for killing and were skilled in all kinds of weapons, whether it was a sword, knife, hammer, axe, or spear. But that was due to years of training and combat experience. To master a weapon in only half an hour, this learning speed could only be comparable to that of the hand crossbow. The other flintlock was handed to Carter. Chief Knight was also intrigued by the novel weapon and was unwilling to put it down. After several rounds of simulations, Roland let them test the power of the weapons with live ammunition. The target was already prepared. It was a plate armor propped up by a wooden stick, held up by two knights standing about 30 feet away. Following the shooting method the prince demonstrated, Iron Axe and Carter aimed and pulled the trigger. The loud noise coming from the first fire startled everyone present. Iron Axe was no exception. But very soon, everyone's faces were colored with astonishment. There was a small hole on the plate armor. The lead shot had cleanly penetrated the thickest part of the armor. Iron Axe had carefully observed the armor before they began shooting. It was evidently not some shoddy product from a handmade workshop. The mark of the hammer and anvil on the neck showed that it was a standard armor from the Blacksmith Society in the Kingdom of Greycastle. The thickest part of the armor was half the thickness of a finger, strong enough to withstand a direct hit from a crossbow at a close distance. The wiser choice to deal with this kind of armor would be to use a heavy crossbow, warhammer, or halberd. Therefore, the flintlock was equally easy to operate as a hand crossbow, but far stronger in power. Its loading speed was also equivalent to that of the hand crossbow. As for the accuracy, a target 30 feet away would be nothing. "Your Highness, the output of this weapon," Carter said. "There are only two at the moment. We can produce two more at most until the months of demons." Iron Axe saw that Carter was visibly relieved. He could roughly guess his thoughts. If this weapon could be manufactured easily, it would take only a few days to train a large number of quick warriors with the flintlocks. There would be no restriction in age, occupation, or even gender. Even a fragile woman could pose a great threat to the knights. Although it was not as shocking as fire of God's punishment, it was still a good weapon. Iron Axe thought it would be easy to kill the giant pachyderm demonic beasts outside the city wall with this power. If he had a flintlock when he was facing the demonic hybrids back then, the outcome might not have been so pathetic. At the scene, Roland alone understood the true meaning of this weapon. With his own hands, he had unveiled the curtains to a firearms war. Chapter 39, The Winter. Roland stood on the city wall and looked out toward the north. In the past month, he repeatedly inspected the castle, the mine, and the city walls, checking every possible detail that might have been neglected. The militia became increasingly skilled at handling the weapons. Under Carter's repeated drills, they had been able to stabilize their spears until the captain who was in charge of the observation gave the order to attack. Standing behind them was the hunter squad. The hunters who stayed in border town that were skilled in bows and crossbows were absorbed into this squad. These experienced hunters were the main force to kill the demonic beasts. Standing on the 4-meter-high city walls and shooting at the corner, it was almost impossible for them to miss the target. The last squad, which was comprised of Iron Axe, Carter, and other 2 elite hunters, was the Flintlock squad. It used 4 pre-installed flintlocks that were forged by the Blacksmith Society and welded and assembled by Anna. Their job was to kill tough monsters whose skins could not be penetrated with crossbow bolts or demonic hybrids. In that 200-meter section, they would be anywhere if there was a need for them. As for the explosive packages, they were stored in a tightly guarded warehouse next to the city walls. They would be separately transported to the city walls when needed. After all, if there was an accident, the explosive packages might cause greater destruction than the demonic beasts did. The demonic beasts could not bite the cement or the rubble, while the explosive packages could send the whole city wall to heaven. So far, Roland had organized 2 actual combat exercises, including the use of explosive packages. Thanks to these 2 exercises, the militia was not so scared of the noise of the explosions that they would throw their weapons away. The other benefit was that the team morale suddenly rose up when it was discovered that the prince held such powerful weapons. "Your Highness," Barov tightened his collar and said, "we've spent half of the income of the ore trade. If the months of demons are as long as the astrologers said, I don't think we can get through the winter." "Then use mine to fill up the vault," Roland said without hesitation, "and continue to trade with Willow Town. The first steam engine has been transported to the mine, and the cleaning of the collapse has almost been completed. So we'll still get a little yield in winter. Especially the rough gemstones, they should be sold as soon as possible and you don't have to consider too much about the price. Storing more food, especially jerky, is always right." Barov nodded. "I will, Your Highness." But, seeing the hesitant look on his assistant minister's face, Roland surely understood what he wanted to say. "Don't worry, I've arranged a boat. If we're totally defeated, I'll leave." "Then I'm relieved," Barov said. Roland smiled at him. "You can go and do your work. I'll have a look again." When Barov left, the prince slowly went up into the watchtower. It was the highest point in the center of the city wall. Standing here, he could overlook the vast jungles and rolling hills ahead. The cold wind whistled, but he did not care. Only in this open and high platform could his tense mood in the face of a war calm down. "You lied to him," said someone around him. "You don't intend to leave at all. Since life is so hard, some things are better hidden. I don't understand what you're talking about. If you think it's difficult being a prince, imagine how hard it is for us." Nightingale appeared. "Even if you won't become a king, as long as you get through the 5 years of the royal decree on the selection of the crown prince, you'll become a lord. Instead of worrying about this, you'd better accompany Anna. I'm afraid she won't live long." Roland was silent for a moment. "I don't think she'll die during the months of demons." "Why do you think so?" "She said she wouldn't lose to the demonic torture." He paused. "And I believe her." "You even believe a witch," said Nightingale, shaking her head. "We are cursed by the demons." "Really?" "I believe you, too." Brian wore casual clothes and stood in front of Greyhound's grave. He gently touched the brand new stone, and looked at the line of words engraved on the pure white surface, nameless but long-living. In memory of the hero of Border Town. Greyhound. The months of demons are coming soon. The demonic beasts may be terrible, but they'll be held back by the line of defense we built together, and they can't move a step further. The man who framed you is still alive, but he won't live long. It's His Highness' commitment to me. Brian bent down and placed a bunch of flowers at the grave. So, goodbye, my friend. Brian silently said to Greyhound. Sister Anna, aren't you scared? Asked Nana, lying on the bed with her legs crossed. Scared of what? The demonic torture. Nightingale said it would be in winter. I became a witch in autumn this year, so it'll be my first time. The first time, Anna said, will really hurt, and sometimes you even wish to die at once. Ah! Nana shouted and immediately covered her mouth. But you'll survive, just like me. I don't know, Nana whispered. I'm not as strong as you. I'm not that strong. Anna closed her eyes and envisioned the scene when she met Roland for the first time. It was in the dark and cold dungeon that he put his clothes on her body and softly said he would hire her. Until now, she still felt it unbelievable. You'll encounter some things that make you want to live on, even if you have to struggle to survive. Such as a steak with sauce. She sighed. How can I know what you want, huh? Seeing Nana staring at herself, Anna wiped her face with her hand and asked, Is there something dirty on my face? No, Nana shook her head. I'm just a little surprised. You never talked to me so much before, Sister Anna. You were so beautiful when you were thinking with your eyes closed. Anna rolled her eyes, jumped out of bed, and went to the window. Nana followed her. What are you looking at? The misty forest? The forest is in the west, Anna said sourly. I can only see the Redwater River here. Sister Anna, look. The girl pointed at the sky. Anna was startled, and then pushed open the window. A cold wind mixed with little snowflakes poured into the room. She stretched out her hand and squeezed the crystal-clear snowflakes. A chill came to her fingers. It's snowing. After a long silence, Nightingale said, You didn't lie. Of course. Roland laughed. I rarely lie. Nightingale did not say anything. She tilted her head, with some unknown look in her eyes. Suddenly, she felt cold on her neck and could not help shrinking. She looked up and found that snowflakes were floating over the city wall. It seemed that there were countless white spirits in the gray sky. They danced in the north wind and flew around, accompanied by the slogan of the militia. The months of demons had begun. Chapter 40, A Family Letter. The firewood burned, but Gerald Wimbledon felt little heat. The tent was large and made from leather, with its bottom rim running flush to the ground. There should be no air leakage. Nevertheless, he still felt cold, especially his toes, which were frozen almost to the point of being numb. Even your piss will freeze in this damned place. He spat and stood up, placing his hands on either side of the table, with the veins on his hands bulging as he lifted upwards, and the 6-square-foot, solid wooden table was lifted off the ground. Releasing the table near the edge of the fire, Gerald felt a wave of comfort. He took off his shoes and put his feet over the fire to warm himself. Then he unrolled some parchment, and continued to write the unfinished letter. Dear Olivia, I've been in Hermes for more than a month, even though the men in the church like to call it the new holy city. Were it not for the agreement on the months of the demons, I still wouldn't wish to stay here. All I want is to return to your home and share a warm bed with you. Thanks to the agreement, the corps monitoring the church became their allies. Very ironic, isn't it? Speaking of the church, I have to admit that what they have done is truly amazing. 20 years ago, Hermes was nothing but mountains and stones, and the church's towns lay at the bottom of the mountain. But now they have paved the way for carriages to go up the mountain, and have also built a large fortress city at the top of the hill. If it were summer, you should have come with me to see this place. The so-called New Holy City is even more magnificent than Grey Castle. And do you remember the theater in Grey Castle? We went together and saw Hamlet. Then you sighed with emotion about how clever the theater was, and the interior was so spacious. But if you see the Hall of Military Affairs in New Holy City, you'll find that the theater in Grey Castle isn't even comparable. I would consider it to be an exquisite work of art instead of a building. Even though the theater is so large, it doesn't have even one pillar to support it. Rather, 8 things like demons' bones stretch out to the outer walls. Then, many branches and hemp rope are attached to these curved bones, and the roof is suspended in the air. How did they figure it out? And as for those bones, if they were in fact taken from demonic beasts, then the demonic beasts must have been more than 33 meters tall. Only in Hermes would one encounter such a creature. But my dear, please don't fear. Even if the demonic beasts are huge, they are no more than minions of demons. And no evil can escape the sanctions of God, neither demonic beasts, witches or demons themselves. Rather, they'll turn to ashes. At this point, Gerald Wimbledon put down his pen, and shook his tingling hands. It was weird that he felt relaxed swinging around a 15-pound, two-handed sword all day, while he felt tired when he rode for a short time. He laughed at himself. I'm really suitable for some rough work. Speaking of demons, I suddenly remembered that my brother was assigned to some sort of poor places like Border Town. I'm afraid that he's already fled to Longsong's stronghold, even though the demons there cannot be compared to those in Hermes. I cannot blame him. If I had gone to such a place, I would have also sought refuge. Therefore, you can see how unfair my father is. Did he intend that my second brother inherit the throne just due to his intelligence? Father has forgotten that he himself didn't win the throne of Grey Castle by intelligence. Since the death of my mother, I've had more and more difficulty figuring out his thoughts. Gerald did not know how to continue, for he did not know whether or not he should tell Olivia the truth. He paused for a moment, and decided to keep writing. If the plan went well, he should have already arrived at Grey Castle Palace when the letter was received. My dear, astrologer Ansger is right. If I don't do anything, the throne will definitely not belong to me. Read this in the star image. The apocalypse star is moving away from the sun. It'll completely deviate from its orbit in at most 4 months. As the astrologer has told me this, there must not be much time left. I cannot remain idle. After today's battle, I'll secretly return to the king's city with my loyal knights. Cold Windridge is far behind Valencia in terms of wealth. But they aren't lacking in courageous warriors. As long as gold is promised, they'll seek the given goal like hungry wolves. Of course, that isn't my ideal method. All I want is to ask Father in person the reason he issued the royal decree on the selection of the crown prince. In the end, what makes him forget that I should have the right to inherit the throne? Astrologer Ansger has already arranged everything. Olivia, my love, you won't wait much longer. The day I become king, I intend to marry you and make you my queen. If I should fail, you have no need to return to the king's city, and you should live a good life in Cold Windridge. Gerald loves you. He carefully placed the folded letter into an envelope, and sealed it with wax oil. After checking it a number of times, he knocked on the table, and a bodyguard quickly entered the tent. "This letter shall be sent to Rosencold-Wind. You needn't travel all day and night, and don't have to ride a horse. You'll be dressed as an ordinary traveler, and should travel between the two places on a business trip. Most importantly, this letter must be sent personally." "Yes, Your Royal Highness." "Good, you may leave." Gerald waved away the guards and simply sat down on the table, his feet hanging over the fiery pit. There was no way back. He closed his eyes and recalled his childhood. At that time, he played hide-and-seek in the garden of the king's city with Timothy and Garcia. When Garcia fell down, he and Timothy went to accompany her. When did the three of them become so distant? Gerald shook his head and put away the confusing thought. Such sentimental things did not suit him. After all, he knew when the confusion would end, when he was on the throne. Just then, the dull sound of a horn came through the tent. "Wah wah wah! They're here!" He jumped up from the table and put on his shoes. Outside the tent, the battalion was already on the move. Running soldiers and flags came together to create a torrent, heading for the battlefield. The sound echoed over the distant mountains, never ending. Demonic beasts were coming. "Come with me." He rode his war horse and came to the top of the city wall. Only when you stood on the walls of New Holy City could you feel its magnificence. It was like an insurmountable natural moat, standing in the foothills of the impassable mountains. The top was flat and wide, so that dozens of people could stand side by side. In front of it lay natural glaciers, and its rear was a plateau. This was the reason that the church so desperately wanted to build New Holy City on top of the mountain. With this harsh terrain, it was almost impossible to break the lines of defense. Gerald Wimbledon had a long-term vision. The strength demonstrated by the church in the creation of Hermes was staggering. They established it in just 20 years, taking timber and stones from the foot of the mountain to its peak. But even though he was no longer disgusted by the church scoundrels, there was something Gerald had to admit. If they did not support the holding of Hermes, all the countries on the continent would face a catastrophe, which was the basis for signing the agreement on the Months of the Demons. When the Months of the Demons came, the four kingdoms bordering Hermes had to send troops to aid the church and fight with the church's judgment army. The four banner flags flew in the wind: the Kingdom of Dawn's Serpent Scepter, the Kingdom of Wolfheart's Knife Shield Crossing, the Iceberg Rose of the Kingdom of Everwinter, and the Tower and Spear of the Kingdom of Greycastle. Looking at the black spots in the distant sky, Gerald Wimbledon clenched his sword. Chapter 41. Demonic beasts appear. As Brian said, when it started snowing in Border Town, it did not stop. The town had been wrapped in a layer of white yarn overnight. In the morning, the amount of snow lessened with only a few snowflakes falling every so often, while the sky remained gray. Roland felt incredulous at the fact that it would be a few months before the sun would be visible once again. It was simply unreasonable, he thought. It was hard enough to find sense in a world with witches and magic power, but how could demonic beasts affect the heavens? Unfortunately, he had no meteorological tools to help him know about the world's current cloud distributions. Walking along the road to the city wall of the western region, Carter could not help but exclaim, "The town seems deserted, and with that, there are some people leaving with the noble families. At least this way, they won't drag us down," said Roland. "I've arranged for a population census this winter." "What's that?" "That means, you need to go door to door and record how many people are left, their name, and career they're engaged in, and then register it," Roland explained. "In this way, we can quickly and effectively allocate human resources during war and distribute pensions after war. Human resources? Carter blinked and then laughed. Your Highness, you really have changed. Why? In the past, you would also say some things I didn't understand and act strangely. At that time, some of what you did didn't match a prince's behavior, but now Carter paused for a moment, and seemed to look for his words. Whether it's your quirky training regulations or the alchemical tests, the results are surprisingly effective. Perhaps this is what my grandfather said, that what made someone extraordinary was that they can see what normal people ignored. I'm beginning to think maybe you really could become the next king. Is that so? Roland's heart felt warm. Was there anything more fulfilling than being approved by healers for men? For a time he felt that his hands and feet were full of strength, and the dark sky was not so oppressing. Along the city wall, the militia team was cleaning up the Isle of Snow. When they saw the prince, they all bowed and gave a salute. They should be taught a proper salute, Roland thought. How was the situation last night? There was no trace of the demonic beasts. It was Iron Axe who answered him. Your Highness, according to previous experience, there'll be a relatively stable period after the first snow. During this period, the number of demonic beasts is small. And mutated animals are small and weak. Roland nodded. Then keep alert. The rear section of the city wall had been transformed into a battalion. When all was quiet, most people would rest in the battalion to save energy. For the guards, a rotation system was implemented. Due to the low winter temperature, each warning patrol only stayed out for 2 hours before being replaced. It was Roland who laid these measures into place. When asking Brian, he found out that Longsong's stronghold had no experience in the fight against the demonic beasts. The most unlucky recruits would be sent to monitor the evil creatures for a whole day on the city wall. This meant that each winter saw 20 to 30 people being hung for the dereliction of duty or the violation of military orders. When the demonic beasts appeared, it was a mess. The defense was not put into divisions, and as such, responsibility was not specified. Thinking of the level of war in that era, Roland understood. There was an extreme emphasis on personal bravery, honor, and pillaging. Even the knights would charge forward in person out of impulse, and one could not expect too much. Roland toured the walls once again. It seemed that all was going smoothly, but Roland found himself ignoring a problem. That was the guidance of the roadblocks. At the moment, these obstacles clearly led the demonic beasts to the center of the city wall, but if what Brian said was true, snow would cover these obstacles within 2 to 3 months. If that happened, they could have to defend from the beasts in a line as long as 600 meters. His staff could not take such wide range into consideration. He could not send a platoon to remove the snow, as a few demonic wolves were enough to make the team suffer heavy losses. Perhaps he would have to rely on the power of the witches once again. For example, let Nightingale sneak out of the city with Anna and melt the snow with fire, and then sneak back. That was similar to how she stole Nana from the pines. At that moment, the observation alarm on the left side of the city wall was sounded. Look ahead. Roland and Carter looked at the position he was pointing to, and a small shadow came out of the snow and moved slowly toward the city wall. Your Highness, do you? A hunter responsible for defense turned around and asked. According to the previous exercise, you should judge whether or not to blow the horn, Roland said, and at this point, you're more experienced than me. He hesitated, and ultimately decided to pull on the strings of his crossbow and continued to observe from the city wall. Roland nodded with satisfaction. For the moment, the order on the city wall was still well maintained. He just did not know if the defense would swiftly organize according to their drills when a large number of demonic beasts attacked Border Town. The shadow gradually approached. When it came to about 50 meters in front of the city wall, Roland was able to see its appearance. Was it just a variant of fox? Its fur was gray and black, and its eyes were flushed. It panted as it reached the city wall. This creature seems to have been just attacked, and it's no threat to us, Iron Axe said as he aimed his bow. You said they were all infected with the breath of hell, and exiled to the west? Not only to the west, said Carter. When the gates of hell open in barbarian land, any place beyond the protection of the impassable mountain range will be attacked by demonic beasts, especially in the north. There, the impassable mountain range seems to be cut off, and the gap is about 5,000 meters. It's also the main direction of the attacks by the demonic beasts. The manic monster wandered around the city wall for a while. Then it raised its head and grinned at the soldiers on the city wall. When it leaped, Iron Axe released his bowstring, and the arrow penetrated its neck, nailing it firmly to the ground. Roland noticed that the blood flowing from it was black. Why could a witch stay conscious after their awakening, but a beast became frantic and alienated when they were ambushed by the same demonic power? If there was ever the chance, I should go to the rear of the impassable mountain range and take a look for myself, he thought. From the prince's memory, the gates of hell was located in a place where humans could not reach. However, as no one had ever gone there, the information found in the ancient books was all rumors and speculations, and not verified. That was questionable. Chapter 42, An Accident. If someone is bitten by a demonic beast, asked Roland, will he turn into something like the beast? He hoped that this was not some otherworldly version of Resident Evil. They could not extract virus antigens with the current technology. Of course not, said Iron Axe, making a confused face. Humans will simply turn into corpses. Can we eat the flesh of the demonic beasts? Carter exclaimed. Your Highness. How can you eat these beasts? They're all tainted by the touch of hell. Roland turned to Iron Axe, who nodded. Your knight is right. Once I tried to cut off a piece of flesh from the beasts and feed it to a hound, but it died soon after. Is that so? What a pity. Roland sighed. Food was so scarce in this era, so if demonic beasts could be eaten, then they could have a huge harvest in the winter. Just imagine, with all the crazed beasts running from the forest to Border Town, they would not even need any hunting tools. Once he finished patrolling the city wall, he decided to pay Nana a visit. He had expropriated a nobleman's house, which was the closest to the city wall, and transformed it into a field hospital. Of course, it was simply a normal hospital to others. Just to be safe, the place was the most heavily guarded place except the city wall. When the house owner escaped to Longsong's stronghold, he took all of his properties with him. Border Town was a place where one could give up at any moment. Even though the house was large, there were no frescoes, carpets, or porcelain to decorate it. If it were not neatly cleaned, it would just look like a house that has been abandoned for a long time. Roland tore down the wooden partition on the first floor to make one large room, leaving only the hallway and entrance intact. He then placed 10 beds to form a simple hospital. There were no nurses, no doctors, and even these 10 beds were unlikely to be occupied. After all, Nana's treatment did not require bed rest. It was immediately effective. During the day, she was on the second floor of the hospital on standby. Anna accompanied her whenever she had spare time. Tigui Pine and Brian were in charge of the first floor, with 2 more guards posted at the entrance. It was foolproof. However, Roland did not expect that the first patient that the hospital received would be a worker from the North Slope mine, rather than some soldier defending the city wall. Nail felt his hands shaking. When he heard Ironhead's hoarse screams, he once again quickened his pace. He wished he could fly to his destination. Everything was a result of his negligence, he thought. He really deserved to die. How could he forget the veteran knight's warnings? He knew that he should not have agreed to operate the large machine alone. Ever since the big, dark machine was installed at the entrance of the mine, work had become a lot easier. In the first place, the most tiring job was removing the ores from the mine. When the basket was filled with ores, it would take 3 to 4 people to drag it. Usually 2 people pushed in the back, with the others pulling from the front. After years of mining, the uneven surface of the tunnel would become flat due to the repetitive transporting of the baskets. The iron pads under the baskets also had to be changed frequently. A week ago, Chief Knight ordered Ironhead and his men to haul some oddly shaped metal pieces up the mountain. After a few days, they assembled the pieces in a furnace. Nail did not expect that the furnace would come to life and start moving on its own. It was both powerful and dynamic. The veteran knight said it was an invention by His Highness called a steam engine. As long as they tied the mining basket to the machine with a hemp rope and ignited a fire, the machine would let out a cry. Then it would turn the winch to pull the basket to the entrance of the mine. It sounded incredible. The veteran knight demonstrated it a few times, and then asked Ironhead to select a person to operate the steam engine. Nail's heart soared when he was selected. As long as he stood in front of that machine, he would never have to dig in the mine or push the basket. That was what he thought, but he had been terrified ever since the landslide accident. He kept the veteran knight's words firmly in his mind. Making the contraption work seemed easy. All he had to do was to lift the green rod and press the red rod down. The veteran knight said that the green rod was connected to the air intake valve, and the red rod was connected to the exhaust valve. And the steam would enter the cylinder through the pipeline. When the basket was pulled up, he would stop the machine by lifting the red rod and pressing the green rod down. Then steam would come from the side of the boiler into the tube. After each cycle, the boiler must be filled with water. Although Nail did not understand the meanings of the valve and cylinder, he promised to operate it step by step. But the veteran knight stressed 2 points. Firstly, he should not mess up the order. He must start from the green then to red rod, and end with the red rod followed by the green rod. If he did this incorrectly, he would probably damage the machine. Secondly, he had to clear out the surrounding miners before emptying the exhaust, and continue shouting out to remind others what he was doing, until the red rod was completely lifted. Nail was sure that he absolutely could not mess up the first point. As for the second, he had some problem. Today, when he turned off the machine as usual, there was no one around. He felt like a fool calling out to an empty room, so he proceeded to pull the red rod silently. The rod was tight, and it took quite an effort for him to lift it. He did not expect Ironhead to appear right then in front of the boiler. Nail swore that he did not see him approach, and the loud roar of the machine masked his footsteps. White steam screeched from the exhaust port and headed straight at Ironhead's face. Nail was frozen in horror, seeing Ironhead fall to the ground. Ironhead clutched his face, rolling around. The mournful screams that he let out gave Nail goosebumps. Soon other miners gathered around. They held down Ironhead, who was still rolling, and forcibly removed his hands. His face was a mess, with blood oozing from the cooked flesh of his skin. His eyes were mere white beads. Everyone there knew that it was the end for him. Behind them, tears welled in Nail's eyes. Ironhead had always taken care of him. Considering his young age, Ironhead assigned him less work than others, but never reduced his pay. But now this happened because of his negligence. Caught in his grief and anxiety, Nail recalled what the veteran knight had said. If someone was accidentally injured in the mining area, they could bring them to the new medical hospital near the city wall. He knew that there was little hope to mend such a serious injury. The wound was too serious and herbs would do little to help. Ironhead's skin would continue to rot, and he would soon fall into a coma because of his fever. Nonetheless, Nail put Ironhead on his back. Clenching his teeth, he ran, ignoring the surprise of the people around him. He knew if he did nothing and simply watched Ironhead die, he would not be able to forgive himself in this lifetime. Chapter 43, Be Strong. Where's Anna? Nana heard footsteps pounding up the stairs and ran to the door to see who it was. She was disappointed to find that it was His Highness. She's still working. She may come later. Work? Nana heard the prince say that word often these days. Do you mean she's burning that grey powder? For the time being, yes. Nana pouted and went back to the table. I also have work, she thought. I stay here and treat those who are injured while defending the town. What is it? Are you bored when Anna is away? Roland smiled. Taking a chair, he sat down by the fireplace. Well, Nana looked down. Honestly, she did not want to help the injured. It was just too terrible. She remembered the scene when she first treated Brian. He was soaked in blood, and the reddish-brown clots solidified in his chest. Red and white blood bubbled out of his dry lips. Upon seeing this, she fainted. She was so ashamed. Nana looked up and stared at the prince, only to find he was snoring in his chair. He seems exhausted, too, she thought. He must have been constructing the city wall and training soldiers to protect Border Town from the demonic beasts. When he invited to come to the castle, she had hesitated for a long time, but in the end she agreed. You'll also encounter something that you want to live for, even if you have to struggle. Nana did not understand the meaning of these words, but when she closed her eyes, she could see Anna. Her blue eyes were like a lake, gently enveloping her. It was because of her that she agreed to help Roland. She wanted to be as strong as Anna. Suddenly, she heard footsteps downstairs. Nana jumped up from her chair to see if it was Anna. However, she was stopped by an invisible hand. Wait, there's more than one person. Nana patted her chest, unnerved. You scared me, Nightingale. The door was pushed open, and Brian, who was in charge of the first floor, came in. Miss Pine, please come down. Someone was burned. This is my work, isn't it? Nana closed her eyes and took a deep breath. All right, I got it. She went downstairs. The two guards were busy placing a man who was moaning painfully on the bed. Next to them stood a small man, looking anxious. Brian came forward and tied the wounded man's hands and feet to the bedside. The guards then sent the small man out of the room and drew the curtain. What happened? Roland went downstairs, rubbing his eyes. Your Highness, this man came from the mine of the northern slope. He seems seriously burned. The prince looked the man over. These are steam burns. Is there any problem with the first machine? Who brought him here? He's in the hall. Brian pointed at the door. I'll go and ask about the situation. You stay here, Roland said as he left the room. Nana slowly went closer and glimpsed at that man from the corner of her eyes. She saw that his face was melted into a ball. His original ruddy skin became pale with dehydration and was hanging onto his face like a rag. On his neck were blisters as large as bowls, some of which had been broken. Mucus with blood wetted the pillow. In the flickering light of the fire, his appearance was more terrible than a demon from a nightmare. She retreated a few steps and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she saw her father was watching her with care. "Are you all right?" Nana nodded and thought about what Roland had told her. It's best to think of treating the wounded like treating a small animal. With this in mind, she went back to the bed and stretched out her hands. An incredible feeling emerged from her body, and she gathered a small part of this power into her palm. She saw a ray of green light flowing out of her palm and onto the injured man's face. Although this green light was so visible to her, others could not see it. The wound then changed. The scalded skin fell off and new skin grew quickly underneath it. The painful moaning of the wounded man gradually stopped. His breathing became even as if he had fallen asleep. Nana exhaled. She performed better than she did the last time, didn't she? My God, is this the healing power His Highness mentioned? This is the first time I've seen it, said Ch26-50. My dear daughter, you're amazing. It's the power of the deities, said Brian. I'm so grateful that Nana helped me when I was injured. Ah, this fool. Nana clutched her face and thought. Didn't he know that Nightingale helped me sneak out to cure him? When was it? Tigui said, surprised. Why don't I know? Well, her strength has nothing to do with the deities. It belongs only to the witch herself. Roland opened the partition and coughed as he joined the two men's conversation. How's the injured man now? Basically healed, said Brian excitedly. It's like he was never injured. Your Highness, with Miss Nana's, everyone will have a chance to survive the month of demons. As long as you don't die on the spot, it's not a problem to keep you alive. The prince nodded, motioning Brian to wake up the man. You're Ironhead, am I right? Ironhead sat up. He said in confusion, Is this a dream? No, said Roland. You're still alive. I've seen you in the square. The man suddenly realized the identity of Roland. He abruptly got down from the bed and fell to his knees. Prince Roland, did you save me? Ch26-50's daughter saved you. She's a witch with healing powers. Nana tensed and wondered if it was okay to say that she was a witch so directly. Sure enough, the look in the man's eyes changed. A witch? Your Highness, aren't they demons? What the hell are you saying? Tigui stood up and shouted unhappily. My daughter doesn't have anything to do with demons. She did save your life. Do you think a demon would lend you a helping hand? No. Please forgive me for my rudeness. Ironhead lowered his head. You saved my life. Thank you, Miss Pine. Nana was overwhelmed by her feelings. She wanted to run out of the room. Still, there was a voice repeating in her head, reminding her to be strong. When Ironhead was sent away, Tigui asked with concern, Is this really all right, Your Highness? If you do this, I'm afraid my daughter won't be able to live a normal life. Think about the positive side, Mr. Pine, the prince said. If we take advantage of this period to break the ice, Nana may be able to have a future where she's truly free. Otherwise, as time passes, she'll one day be exposed. When that day comes, I'm afraid I can do nothing but hide her. Truly free? Nana did not know, but right now she felt like she was free. But if what His Highness said became true, then Nana could also leave the castle on her own. Would she return to Teacher Carl's college? Chapter 44, The Unspoken Answer. When Roland returned to the castle, It was already dark and snowing heavily again. He went into the bedroom and removed his coat. He shook off the snow at the collar, and hung it on the hanger beside the fireplace. "Your Highness, don't you think this matter was handled too hastily?" Nightingale appeared in front of the prince. "Nana?" Roland poured a glass of ale for Nightingale and himself. Although the wine was much bitterer than the beer he was used to in his past life, he had gradually become accustomed to its taste. Nightingale took the cup and held it in her hand but did not drink. She was waiting for the prince's answer. "There's no better time than now." Roland downed his wine and refilled his cup. "If we want to develop Nana's power before the months of demons, we can't conceal her identity as a witch. She can instantly heal fatal injuries in a way more efficient than the ordinary herbal medicines or bloodletting therapy. I'm sure people will realize this. It's a blessing that this small town is outside the border of the western region, therefore, the church has very limited influence on it. If I were them, I would not be willing to spend gold royals on this unimportant place either." Roland went on. "The town didn't even have a chapel, and the missionaries returned with the noble to Longsong's stronghold a long time ago. What do you think of Border Town now? It's an island cut off from the outside world." "You planned this long ago?" Nightingale asked. Roland nodded. "The snow will bury the road leading to Longsong's stronghold, and the docking of the ships at the port is controlled by me. We have at least 3 months to correct the wrong idea that witches are evil. If we depend just on publicity, the effect is very limited. So we need to rely on close contact, in order to quickly eliminate this layer of misunderstanding." That was why he wanted to keep Nana at all costs. He wanted to create a Florence Nightingale in this world. Due to this legendary nurse's dedicated efforts to take care of the wounded, the casualty rate was reduced from 42% to 2%. She was conferred the title of the Lady with the Lamp, and she raised the reputation of nurses. And Nana's ability was even more magical. Through magic power, she could cure trauma and revive lives as long as it was not death on the spot. This was probably better for the morale of the militia than any weapon. Moreover, thanks to her father's identity as a noble in decline and his association with hunters and farmers, he had a peaceful attitude towards civilians, and even allowed Nana to attend Teacher Carl's college. As compared to the other nobles, even the lowest-ranking baron would not be happy to allow his daughter to mix with civilians. In their eyes, these people were so-called lowlifes. Can these really be done? Even if it were Nightingale, when faced with a powerful authority like the church, she would still appear particularly weak. If we don't try, we'll never know the answer. Roland did not expect the whole town to change their view, but at least this new platoon he formed had to be firmly grasped in his hands. Later on, he would rely on these people, who came from the civilians, to promote his ideas. 3 months were enough to change a lot of things. Nightingale was silent for a moment, and then whispered, "Why are you doing this for the witches?" "In order to liberate productivity, become more powerful, and have a place in the royal decree on the selection of crown prince." Of course, these answers were not suitable to be said at this moment. Even though Roland was a mechanical engineer, he had also played a variety of galgam. So it could be said he had also seen many battles. 2 decades of experience reminded him that this time he was facing a key question. He pondered the right words to say, and then slowly replied, "I've already told you a long time ago, that Border Town doesn't care about your background. I hope that one day, even a witch, can live like a free man in my domain." This time Nightingale was silent for a long time. Only the crackling of charcoal burning could be heard in the room. Her side profile shone like a beautiful picture under the bright firelight. When she spoke again, Roland felt time had regained movement. In fact, you don't have to do this. Her voice was remote yet gentle. Please forgive me for lying to you earlier on. My sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association have been drifting around for a long time. They don't have many expectations. Just a place to settle down would satisfy them, even if it was in the castle. How would that be different from a cage? Roland shook his head. Then suddenly it dawned upon him. He stared at Nightingale. Hang on, are you saying that you now allow them to come over? Nightingale sighed and avoided eye contact with the prince. In that case, you'll become an enemy of the church. They had gone too far, Roland said nonchalantly. Once the divine right of kings becomes a slogan, the conflict between the church and the mainland countries will break out sooner or later. As for Border Town, as long as we can live through these 3 months, the church can't do much harm to us. We're far from the base of the church. Will the bishop bring the judgment army across the entire kingdom of Greycastle to capture me? My father won't allow such a thing to happen. This would be a serious provocation of the royal majesty. After Nightingale bowed and left, Roland lay in the bed, and let out a sigh of relief. He did not tell her all his thoughts, such as the church was far away, and according to the speed of communication in that world, they probably would not respond until early summer. Plus the long distance and his identity as a prince, it meant the church would probably only send envoys to investigate the situation. It would take half a year to carry out a round trip. By then, he would have the ability to break the ties with them. Therefore, the biggest danger was not the church, but the witches themselves. This point was noticed only by Roland. Although the witches were now at a disadvantage, the situation would not last forever. Witches did not rely on blood heritage, but instead a random awakening, which meant witches could not be exterminated, and they would only increase in numbers. The church relied on God's stone of retaliation to maintain their advantage over the witches, but this could only be used to offset the magic power. By the look of things, the witches' awakening not only gave them a variety of abilities. Even their physical qualities, thinking agility, and their appearance were superior to ordinary people. They were in essence considered new mankind. The more brutal the oppression was, the more intense the resistance would be. When a riot led purely by the witches arose, how much damage would that cause to the kingdom of Greycastle? The hatred caused by the church, once uncontrollable, could very likely be transferred to the same hate toward the kingdom and its people. Roland did not wish to see that happen. So he needed to start from Border Town. He first had to frame a structure to accommodate both parties, and promote this to the entire kingdom of Greycastle, and even the mainland kingdom. He wanted to build a world where witches and ordinary people could coexist. Chapter 45, The Conspiracy Part 1. When the moon started to set, Gerald Wimbledon saw the flickering silhouette of the city wall of the King's City. After a few months, he was finally back. Thinking of that, he felt the fatigue of the long journey diminished greatly. But he still remained vigilant, and tightly pulled his horse, beckoning his assistant to go ahead and inquire about the situation. If the plan did not change, astrologer Ansgar should have already replaced the city guards with Gerald's men. After the assistant shot out the signal, Ansgar would let down the side drawbridge. Gerald kept his eyes wide open, as if he was afraid to miss the faint fire. He did not have to wait long, but Gerald felt like time had stopped. When his eyelids became too weary, he finally saw the distant flickers, twice under the city wall, and thrice above, just like it was planned. He took a deep breath and waved his troops forward. By the look of things, he was only one step away from the throne. Gerald rode through the side door of the city wall, with the assistant by his side. Behind them were more than 20 cavalries. They were all silently pulling the reins, and controlling the mount to inch forward slowly. The city walls of the king's city were made of materials obtained from fallen Dragon Ridge. The gray-colored stone had a dark red luster under the torch, as if it was soaked in blood. The whole city wall was about 6 meters wide. And in order to build this wall that was out of this world, more than 1,000 slaves and masons died on the site. An army of 10,000 could not overcome this impregnable wall, but yet he was sliding through it so easily. Gerald thought to himself that any loophole must have started from the inside. All of a sudden, he recalled New Holy City. Would their seemingly more magnificent and indestructible wall be destroyed from the inside as well? Your Highness, I've been awaiting your arrival for a long time. Marching through the gates, he saw Astrologer Ansger and a small platoon waiting. Seeing Gerald appear, Astrologer Ansger quickly dismounted, bowed and saluted. Gerald cast his distractions aside. He was probably so excited that he unwittingly let his imagination run wild. You did well. Have you also swapped the palace guards? Your Highness, the plan had a small mishap. Silver Knight, who promised to serve you, was transferred to the Southern Territory 3 days ago. So now there's only time to replace the palace chamber guards. Gerald frowned, as this meant that he could not bring all the 20 people into the palace. The guards would not attempt to stop him, but would also not allow so many armed men to enter the royal premises. Oh well, assign me 2 guards from the chamber platoon. The rest can stay the entrance, and ensure outsiders don't come in and bother me. He hesitated for a second before confirming. Although the plan had changed, the situation was still under control. Father's guards would generally stay overnight in the outer rooms. As long as someone could hold them off for a moment, he was confident that he could obtain victory. Entering the inner city, he saw everything he used to be familiar with. Although it was night, he could still recognize every street. This was his territory without a doubt. Everyone jumped off their horses, and advanced quickly toward the palace. As they arrived at the door, the cavalry spread out according to the new plan, forming an ambush outside the palace. Just like Astrologer Ansger said, although the guards were surprised as to why the prince returned at night to the king's city, they still let him enter as Gerald lied that he had something important to report. After all, he was the eldest son of the Kingdom of Greycastle, first in line to the throne. The prince and Astrologer Ansger went through the garden and the hall, and right in front was King Wimbledon III's residence. The astrologer lifted the torch in his hand and shook it from left to right. Immediately, guards walked out of the darkness, and knelt down to the 2 men. Your Highness, please come with me. Gerald sniffed his nose and smelled a bloody odor. Had not the chamber guards been completely replaced? He looked at the guard by firelight, and it was someone familiar, a knight of the Earl who supported his succession plans. This made him feel a little more at ease. Did someone get into the castle? Your Highness, His Majesty summoned a maid in the evening. And when she came out, she saw our exchange, replied the other. Please rest assured. We've dealt with it. Gerald felt a little surprised, but now it was not the right time to bother about such a minor thing. He nodded and did not say anything more. He followed the guards into the castle, and the others followed behind them. Gerald knew the castle like the back of his hand, and he could walk from one end to the next with his eyes closed. He had lived here for more than 20 years, and he knew exactly where the secret tunnels or hidden doors were. But his purpose now was to persuade his father to pass the throne to himself. Sneaking into the chambers was meaningless. He also had to get rid of the guards outside, so that his father could completely understand his situation. Then they could sit down and talk seriously about the attribution of the inheritance. If he could not convince his father, Gerald Wimbledon took a deep breath, reached out and beckoned everyone to stop. He then pulled out the hand sword at his back. The bronze door at the end of the corridor was the only entrance to the palace chambers. Behind the door was the outer chamber, but also the last line of defense. 2 to 3 guards were usually stationed there, so that they could rush into the chambers to protect His Majesty at the first sign of danger. Gerald first pushed the door to open a small slot. Then he used his shoulder to bang the door, fleeing quickly into the room, whilst holding his sword in an attacking stance. But the outside chamber was silent, without a single soul. At the same time, a strong bloody stench covered his nose. His heart flashed an unknown premonition, and he ran straight toward the bedroom. Shortly after, Gerald witnessed a scene that he could hardly believe. King Wimbledon III was sitting on his bed in his robes, and his upper body leaning against the pillow. His robe was open, and a hilt was inserted into his chest. Blood dripped down his raised stomach and soaked the quilt. Standing beside his father was his younger brother, Timothy Wimbledon. How could this happen? Gerald stood motionless. Just like you, my elder brother. Timothy sighed. I didn't want to do this. He clapped his hands, and a number of armored warriors quickly poured through the door to surround the royal prince. This is a chess game, and I originally wanted to follow the rules. Brother, did you know? Garcia did not respect the rules from the start. Of course you too. If not, why would she rush to the king's city after hearing the astrological prophet of astrologer Answer? Seriously, if you didn't show up, I wouldn't know what to do. Astrologer. He gritted his teeth and looked back. Astrologer Answer stepped back and said, I didn't lie to you. The apocalypse star is far away from Blaze Day is a metaphor that the lost has strayed from the right path, but it also has the meaning of destruction. Now Gerald finally understood. He had fallen into a well-designed trap from the very beginning. The stench of blood at the door of the castle was not left by some maid, and Silver Knight had not been transferred away. But the most disappointing fact was, Astrologer Answer, who had taken care of him for more than a decade, and taught him to read and write from an early age, still chose the second prince, just like his father. Timothy Wimbledon. Were both his sons, but he devoted so much effort to you and assigned the best territory to you. Yet you were the first to lay your hands on him. You're a demon from hell. Anger flashed in Timothy's eyes but quickly disappeared. Do you really think so? Dear brother, if you failed to persuade him to let you inherit the throne, would you really walk away quietly? Don't deceive yourself. Chapter 46, The Conspiracy Part 2. Gerald knew that he was now backed into a corner, and all he could do was to drag his younger brother together to hell. At this moment, he was actually calm. Do you just want to get rid of me? Get rid of you? No, that's of no help to me, my dear brother. I had no choice but to resort to this. Timothy's tone was still calm as if he was stating a fact. If I had patiently waited for 5 years, I would probably end up having to face Garcia's pirate army. Do you know what she has been up to recently? Gerald shook his head and estimated the distance between himself and the second prince. He remembered his younger brother was very smart since childhood, but he was not good at riding at battle. As long as he could find the opportunity to rush forward to cut off, she is forming her own army, brother. Really, I admire her. She did this even before the royal decree on the selection of crown prince. Even I did not expect this from her. When we were children, we all got along so harmoniously. How did we end up here, planning to kill each other? He said, and then retreated 2 steps. For example, I'm afraid now you just want to split me into 2 halves with your sword, right? I know it, brother. You are still the same as before. When you want to kill, your eyes have a horrific stare, Timothy sighed. Let me tell you honestly. I want to terminate the royal decree on the selection of crown prince. If not, the fleet of Garcia would be waiting for me 5 years later. She had already controlled the port of Clearwater a few years ago. And Valencia was suitable for creating businessmen, but not for raising fighters. I need an army that can resist Garcia's fleet, and this can't be achieved by a trade city. Gerald Wimbledon, tomorrow you'll be judged because you left your domain and assassinated the king. I have to return to Valencia tonight to make preparations before the bad news spreads to the eastern region. I'll be deeply sad, and step up rightfully as the second successor. And you'll be sent to the guillotine on the charges of killing the king. You! Gerald screamed and rushed toward his younger brother, but the distance was too great. His sword was intercepted by 2 armored guards. Then his calf numbed, as a dagger pierced his calf. Gerald suddenly lost his balance and fell crooked to the ground. The crowd swarmed forward, and he was tightly pressed to the ground, bound and unable to move. Judge? Do you think you're qualified to judge me? I'll divulge all of this, and let the people who support you know what kind of monster you are. Of course you won't, my brother, said Timothy patiently. The alchemic workshop has a medicine called Forgotten Language, which is made up of mixed lizard venom and horse's milk from the sandy land of the Southern Territory. After drinking it, you won't be able to make any sound. Rest assured you won't feel any pain. Instead, the taste is sweet, smooth and quite intoxicating. If you want to blame someone, then blame our talented sister. If not for her, I would not have to do this. He waved to the leader of the guards, and the latter also nodded in reply and saluted. The royal prince was pulled out of the palace. The other armored guards also filed out. Finally, only the second prince and astrologer Ansgar were left. Your Highness, your throne is now secured, so I should call you Your Majesty, astrologer Ansgar said, bowing. You did really well, and when I get on the throne of the Kingdom of Greycastle, I will fulfill our arrangement. But, seeing my brother's tragic appearance today, I feel certain promises should be accompanied by a guarantee clause. The astrologer's expression immediately changed. Your Highness, you mean, don't worry. I just don't want to be betrayed. Timothy pulled out a wax pill from his arms. You must have seen this quite often. The wax pill's shell takes 7 days to completely dissolve, about the same time it takes for me to return from the King's City to Valencia. I've used the position of chief astrologer as a price for your collaboration, and I don't wish for others to pull you away at a higher price. Your Highness, you must be joking. The astrologer's face turned white blank. Yet he still bit the bullet and swallowed the wax pill in the end. Smart choice, said Timothy, nodding with satisfaction. Now you can go. When the palace was empty, the second prince's face was gloomy. He grabbed the porcelain on the bedside table and thrashed it on the ground. The porcelain was smashed into pieces. A guard came in immediately. Your Highness? Get out. He roared. Yes. The latter quickly headed out of the room and shut the door. His plan did not include killing his father. By virtue of the king's preference, he just needed to highlight Garcia's actions to the king and stop her. Plus he had Prince Gerald Wimbledon as bait. Timothy thought that his plan was infallible. He used the position of chief astrologer to lure Gerald's Enlightenment mentor, the low-ranking astrologer Ansger in the Astrologers Association, into writing a letter to Gerald. And Gerald got hooked quite quickly. This was also in line with Timothy's judgment. His elder brother was stronger at fighting than thinking, whilst not willing to hand over the throne. The next few letters stirred up the ambition of the first Prince Gerald, and Timothy also finished preparing the next step. When the last letter with the astrological prophecy was issued, he secretly returned to the king's city, to reveal the news that the first Prince Gerald might be planning a takeover. There was no doubt that once the matter was confirmed, his father would fly into a rage and send the first Prince Gerald into prison. He would face either imprisonment to death or exile. Then, his father would look upon the other children, and Garcia, who was expanding her army rapidly, would certainly be a natural choice. But why did it turn out like that? Father heard his news, smiled strangely instead, pulled out a dagger, and pierced his own chest. Everything happened so fast that Timothy could not react in time, and could only watch his father die in front of him. He sat down feebly along the bedside. For the first time, he felt he was also a pawn in a game of chess. Father's last smile was like a nightmare, making him feel creepy. He went over the whole thing repeatedly, and even examined the body, but still, could not find a clue. Why would Father do that? He also suspected that this person was a fake. But he could find no evidence, and even the hidden wound at the back was a match. Knowing Gerald was about to arrive at the king's city, he had to pretend to be calm, and replace the whole program. He would blame the death of King Wimbledon III onto Gerald, and then use his position as second heir to succeed the throne ahead of time. As long as the coronation was smooth, he would no longer be subject to territorial restrictions. This meant he could directly mobilize the power of the Duke of the Southern Territory to threaten Garcia and force her to give up the port of Clearwater. So it seemed that the outcome was not bad either, but Timothy could not help but feel uneasy, as if there were an invisible hand that had unsuspectingly joined the struggles at the Kingdom of Greycastle. However, he was completely ignorant about it. At the moment, other than firmly grasping the throne, he had no choice. Timothy Wimbledon swore to himself. If he found out who was behind this, he would be sure to let the culprit know the consequences of annoying a king. Chapter 47. The market and cycle border town had been fairly peaceful over the week. According to Ironax and Brian, the strength and the number of demonic beasts would gradually increase as the months of demons continued. Taking advantage of the current defensive pressure, Roland sent a sloop loaded with ores to Willow Town. Due to the use of the steam engine, the number of workers in the North Slope mine had been reduced by half, while the output increased steadily, allowing it to the level it had been at before it collapsed. The use of machines greatly lowered the manpower required. Meanwhile, Roland carried on a preliminary reform of the mining system, turning the fixed compensation into a floating salary. He set a daily average output tallied by Baroff as a standard, and going above by a certain amount would end in additional remuneration. In addition, anyone who found gemstones or mineral veins could claim extra rewards. This measure effectively promoted the workers' enthusiasm, and lively scenes could be seen everywhere in mining areas. Roland naturally would like to do something now that the ore was in his hands. Besides the steam engine, he also planned to manufacture a series of machine tools. Machine tools had a long history, and generally speaking, they were tools used to produce other tools. So an anvil, which was manually fixed and forged, could be regarded as the most original machine tool. Making tools by hand was not all that bad, however, the issue lay in the ungainly positioning of the tools. Thus, people added clip or groove on the tool stand to fix the parts that were processed. The early harquebus and flintlock were both handmade on anvils with grooves. As time went on, merely depending on manpower could not meet the demand of processing, and then the machine tools evolved and expanded. The machine tool applied different fixed methods and toolings according to different usages. In addition, the linkage of handwork and machinery could effectively improve the efficiency of process. Roland considered making the manual milling machine. Although the milling machine had versatile functions, he would simply use it to produce involute gears, and its frame could be simplified. All it needed was a pair of card slots and a rotatable steel mill. With the help of Anna, a specific molding mill specialized in cutting gears could be easily produced. The top of grinding tool was polished into the shape of a trapezoid and was heated to a hot red state. Then marks were drawn with iron bars, followed by a quench-hardening treatment in water. That was how a customized mill was produced. After solving the key problem, Roland immediately called Carter to hire 2 carpenters to forge the milling machine base, while Anna continued to make other metal parts in the castle backyard. There was no doubt that metal processing had become as easy as making pottery with the help of Anna, especially after she grew skilled in controlling her flames. The initial production of small parts all depended on her. Seeing her melting iron ingots into a fluid iron liquid and kneading it, Roland marveled unceasingly. Without the witches, it would have taken over 10 years to achieve what he had imagined. 2 days later, the first simplified milling machine was placed in the backyard. Recently, Roland had been busy designing a set of gears, which would be used to regulate the speed and stabilize the output of the steam engine. The relevant fluted discs were in the molding process. Once the milling machine was finished being assembled, the process of gear milling would be carried out. Gears were nothing new for Chief Knight Carter. The drainage of water in most of the mines in the world was achieved by livestock pulling wooden gears with a winch mechanism. Carter was satisfied this time. He was able to understand what the prince was doing. Roland told him to bring 3 blacksmiths and their apprentices to learn how to operate the milling machine in the backyard. It was unlikely that Roland was going to operate these machine tools, so he had to train some skillful workers. After their respectfully saluting, Roland started to demonstrate how to use the milling machines to produce gears. Roland did not mind serving as the demonstrator at all. Actually, he just would seem like a type of prince that had various hobbies. Besides, being considered as half-assed, it was easy for him to operate the machine tools. Carter was responsible for pouring warm lard on the side. In that era, it was a waste to replace oil lubrication by lard. However, something was better than nothing. The lard fell down into a ceramic bowl after soaking the mill, and it could be used repeatedly. Roland firstly carved an indentation on the fluted disc according to the designed angle. Then he set the fluted disc upright and fixed it on the working table. Next, he pulled the mill above the fluted disc, aiming at the inscribed line, then pressing the pedal. The belts transferred the power generated by pedals' wooden wheels to the mill shaft. Later on, Roland held fast to the mill handle and pulled down slightly, and then the rotating mill cut the fluted disc slowly at an angle of 90 degrees. As the material of the fluted discs was pig iron, it was not hard to carve the indentation, Despite the fact that the mill was working the rolled steel after the quenching process, the air was thick with the fragrance of lard, causing the blacksmiths and apprentices who did not eat meat for a long time to swallow their saliva. After the demonstration, it was time to sign the contract. The business in Border Town had just begun, and the industry was even more recent. Therefore, neither steam engines nor machine tools would get popular immediately. At this time, the majority of people could hardly understand the huge power those things represent or their potential. As a result, Roland had to promote the machines by himself. The contract said that the smithy using milling machines had to process one set of gears every week. All the needed materials should be provided by the castle, and the processing fee was 10 silver royals. Besides, the machine tools were not free, and the process functioned more like renting. The smithy had to pay 2 silver royals to use the tools. During the months of demons, the business in the smithy was not as prosperous as before. It was an order from the prince, and it could also benefit the smithy. Thus, nobody went against this order. At the same time, Roland told them that it was the first milling machine, and there would be more milling machines being produced constantly. Anyone who was interested could apply at the city hall. "Your Highness, why don't you directly make the processing fee 8 silver royals?" Carter asked, confused, after the blacksmiths went away. "The amount is the same, but the meanings are different," Roland explained. "This is probably the first commercial lease contract in Border Town. I need to set an industry standard." Carter wiped his forehead, knowing that His Highness was talking nonsense. He had experienced this situation. The prince would carry on talking if he pretended to listen carefully. A good start can lead to a virtuous cycle. At present, only I need to buy gears, so I provide machine tools. They get rewarded for their labor. Later, when others also need them, the blacksmiths will realize that they can get more commissions from buying the machine tools than renting them. Roland paused. Thus, whenever they confront new things, they would consider applying the method of alternative production to avoid the risks. "I can get rewards by renting the tools out, and the subsequent development of new things will be decided by the market. That's a virtuous cycle." Chapter 48: The Assembly. With high spirits, Roland was about to give a long harangue on how to establish a reasonable market when there came the hum of horn. This was unusual, as only when the patrol team could not handle the issue would the alarm signal sound out. Roland and Carter looked at each other and then rushed to the castle's backyard. Roland mounted the horse which had been prepared by the guards and headed for the city wall with Carter and his healers. When they boarded the city wall, the militia was already in place. To Roland's relief, there was suddenly an array of guns on the top of wall. It seemed that the eggs did work. Roland looked northwesterly, finding a group of demonic beasts approaching Border Town. Roland guessed there were about 20 evil beasts. Iron Axe ran to Roland from his guarding position, giving a salute and reporting to Roland, "Your Highness, there is something weird about those demonic beasts." "Weird? Do you mean that they generally don't take collective action?" "No," Iron Axe explained. "Colonial animals would forever be colonial animals. Take wolves for example. Their habitual nature won't be changed. However, these demonic beasts are not the same kind, and they are not supposed to take actions together. Some hunters even witnessed them fighting with each other before. Demonic beasts were often mutated. They had a burning desire to hunt, were prone to be infuriated, and did not know how to avoid risks. In a sense, they had lower intelligence than beasts." Roland carefully observed for a while, finding different sizes and species of beasts, including demonic wolves and demonic bison. Roland thought it didn't mean that they knew the importance of collective actions. Because they were still guided by the barriers and traps furnished by Iron Axe. All the beasts had been gradually getting close to the front of the city wall. Vanner was so nervous that his wet palms could not grip his gun tightly. While nobody was noticing, he secretly wiped the sweat using his clothes. The hunters who were responsible for observation repeatedly said, "Relax and take a deep breath." Vanner did as what the hunters said over and over. However, his could not cease to be nervous, because he had heard so many rumors about how fierce the demonic beasts were for the past 10 years when he lived in the western region. Since the start of Months of Demons, the hunter squad had killed some scattered demonic beasts under the city wall, which had eased his fear for them a little, and he had thought he could be brave enough to face the fierce beasts. The fact was, he was not that brave. Being picked out by His Highness to be Deputy Force Commander of the Spear Squad, Vanner tried to keep his expression calm, maintaining the appearance of an armed guard. The beasts were getting closer to Vanner, and he could recognize what they looked like. At the head of the beasts was a demonic bison, whose 2 shiny black emblems were as thick as his arms. Its fur was just like a cloak, fully covering its body. Vanner felt the ground was quaking while the demonic bison was about 70 meters away from the city wall. He licked his dried lips, waiting for the thrust order from the hunters. A loud noise was heard. The demonic beast did not slow down and directly ran into the city wall, shattering its brain and splashing its black blood. Before Vanner could catch his breath, 2 demonic wolves swooped down. Stab. Hearing the order from the hunters, Vanner subconsciously raised his gun and tried to stab the wolves even though they were not in his attack range. The effect was not as good as they trained. Some thrust their guns immediately after the wolves jumped up, and some failed to react in time after receiving the order. As a consequence, there was only one demonic wolf being pushed back, while another one fell down on the top of the wall. "Stay in formation," the hunters shouted loudly. Although he was wondering which side the demonic beast would attack, Vanner still remembered what Iron Axe had warned them. When you focused on the things behind you, the danger would come from the front. He kept closely staring at the oncoming beasts, holding fast to his gun. The hunter squad was obviously more experienced than the spear squad. Before the demonic wolf fell down, the hunters had pointed their machetes at the beast. Iron Axe was pretty nimble. He directly dashed to the beast, smashed at its waist with his gun stock, and then watched it roll a few circles in the air. The demonic beasts were great in both physical stamina and defensive ability. Thus, such attack would not cause it too much damage. After falling down, the beast got up instantly and showed its sharp fangs. Iron Axe had already pointed his gun to its forehead. Then came a gunshot. The skull of the demonic beast flew into the air and its body retreated back, collapsing and trembling. The damn beast was dead now. You need to continue keeping your position. Ah, my stomach. Someone was screaming. Vanner glanced at him from the corner of his eye and saw a member of the platoon team sitting beside the city wall, hands stained with blood. His thumb was out. It was scratched by the claws of demonic wolves. "Please help me, damn it. Bind up with a cloth." The scene was chaotic. A few demonic boars with rough skin rushed at the city wall and were hit by crossbows of the hunters. "Calm down," Roland shouted loudly. He was blocked by Nightingale just now and arrived at this moment. "Don't you remember what to do if someone get hurt during the training? Follow the rules." What Prince said reminded Vanner of his responsibility. As Deputy Force Commander of the City Walls Defense Team, there should be someone organizing the rescue when there was an injury. He named his 2 teammates and said, you take him to the hospital quickly." According to his previous experience, there was no chance that this man could survive. His Highness, instead, considered it to be more important to follow the orders and regulations, especially for the member of the militia. After the wounded were carried away, the order was restored on the city wall. The demonic beasts seemed to be of numerous quantities, only a few could impose threats on the people atop the city wall. The hunter squad shot the left demonic beasts one by one, and Vanner eventually took a deep breath. He felt he had used up all of his energy during this half an hour's battle. At this moment, the hunters on the alert in the watchtower of the city wall shouted again, "My gosh, what's that?" Vanner also saw it. Although it was a long distance from the city wall, it must be a buster from its silhouette. Vanner firmly believed that it would be larger than 10 cattle together. Only Iron Axe recognized what that monster was at once. He sucked in a breath. There was no doubt that it was a demonic hybrid, and that this would bring them big troubles. Chapter 49. The demonic hybrid. Roland could not believe his eyes. From a distance, it looked like a gigantic tortoise with 2 heads. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to have 2 wolf heads. Roland thought to himself. The gigantic demonic beast was as high as the city wall and almost 6 meters long, with 6 short and thick feet in the shape of rhinoceros legs. The size of each leg was equal to that of an adult human's body. As for its heads, the 2 wolf heads were unlike those of the common 2-headed monsters in films, which either let out howls in turn or snapped at each other. Instead, the 2 heads sank low, with their eyes dimmed and their movements like zombies. The most eye-catching thing about it was the shell on its back. The shell's surface had a dim grayish-brown color and was covered with moss. With one glance one could tell that it was incredibly hard. This shell was similar to that of a tortoise. It covered the monster from head to tail. If the monster could retreat into its shell like a tortoise, it would definitely be hard to kill it. But Roland was not worried, since a demonic beast that moved so slow was destined to be a target. Even if firearms could not penetrate its shell, it would be easy to hit a wolf head outside the shell. If it hit in the shell, they could blow it with dynamite. "Your Highness, this is a demonic hybrid." Iron Axe approached him with a grave face. "Now I understand why there has been a collective action of demonic beasts of different species. They were all driven by this demonic hybrid." Roland thought and nodded. "This one is rather different from the one you saw last time. It's also the first time that I've ever seen a demonic hybrid of this kind. Though it looks clumsy, you shouldn't underestimate it. Any of the demonic hybrids would be hard to tackle." "It's almost within the range," Roland said, "and let the archers try first." It snowed lightly, while the wind blew rather unpredictably from the northwest. The weather was not good for archery. But the 2 huntsmen chosen by Iron Axe seemed confident enough. They ascended the lookout tower and shot their arrows according to their judgment of the instantaneous wind direction. The 2 arrows behaved like a pair of eyes. After they rose to a vertex, under the influence of both wind and gravity, they fell and landed almost vertically on the targeted shell. Just as expected, the arrows were repelled, and this action even sounded off an attention tone like a game in Roland's mind. The 2 huntsmen continued to shoot their arrows calmly for another 2 rounds. The last round was successful, because the arrows landed at the interior of the monster. One arrow landed right onto a wolf head, while the other stuck into the neck of its target. However, it did not screech angrily or increase its attacking speed. It stopped for a moment, and then hid its heads and feet into the shell while moving on. This incident baffled everyone. The beast looked then like a tank with its chassis lowered. The ridge of the shell almost touched the ground. In this way, Even the best archer could not shoot their arrows into its body. "Use flintlock," Roland commanded. Now the target was about 17 meters away from the city wall. Even a flintlock without rifling could not miss it. Carter and Iron Axe came to the parapet quickly, mounted their guns, aimed, and fired. While the smoke was dispersing, Roland could see clearly how the bullets hit the shell and made tiny fragments sputter. A small section of the shell cracked. Yet the demonic hybrid was unaffected and maintained its speed. He thought to himself, it was a pity that the lead bullets were too soft and prone to deformation. They were unfit to penetrate the thick shell. It would be unrealistic to attempt to shatter the hybrid's shell with these 4 guns. They would have to resort to the explosive packages. Iron Axe made the same judgment like the prince. He commanded Deputy Force Commander of the Spear Squad to carry the dynamite, while the beast was already butting the city wall. When it found it could no longer advance, its shell began to vibrate with such an unbelievable speed and hit the wall with high frequency like a rotary hammer. Stone chips instantly splattered and several cracks spread quickly along the weak spots. The rubble wall had a high compressive capability, but yet its tensile and shearing strengths were extremely low. To be more specific, it was almost defenseless against vibration. The people on the city wall all felt it. Soon, a loud friction noise pierced the ears of everyone and informed them that the hybrid's shell had cut a slit into the wall. Yet the crashing did not stop. The beast moved again until the whole interior of its body was embedded into the city wall. The militia fled from the part of the city wall that was covered with cracks, while the invisible Nightingale carried the prince in her arms and jumped from the wall. If anyone had stared at the prince at that moment, he would find the prince had descended like an apparition. When Van arrived carefully with a pack of dynamite, he found that the middle part of the city wall had an almost 3-meter wide opening. The demonic beast who had crossed the wall then stopped vibrating and continued to advance with its previous speed. "Hurry up!" Iron Axe said loudly. "Light the dynamite and place it under the beast." Though his hands were shaking, Vanner retained the clearness of mind. He remembered every detail of the training about how to use an explosive package. Unlike the packages used in training, each of these explosive packages contained less dynamite and was sealed with wooden planks. Fragments of mining waste were stuffed between the packages and planks. Its firing equipment was also optimized with an extractor of flint and copper wire. When this part failed, at the end of the package there was still a normal fuse. He tore the cloth soaked with oil at the outermost layer in a flurry and pulled at the copper wire with all his strength. From the wooden box there soon came a short buzzing sound. Then smoke appeared. That was a sign it had been successfully lit. The fuse that had been soaked in salt burned rather slowly and would take about 30 seconds to burn. The world turned quiet for Vanner when he saw the white smoke that came out of the box. He had seen how powerful this thing could be. If it exploded in his hand, not even a fragment of his corpse would remain. 27 seconds. Vanner listened to his pumping heart and silently counted. He walked up to the demonic beast and placed the lighted explosive package on its path. 15 seconds. Then it crushed the package. Nothing could stop its advancing movement. 9 seconds. Vanner turned around and ran. 6 seconds. 3 seconds. There came a boom. Vanner felt the ground beneath his feet vibrated. Then the world continued its hustle and bustle. He turned and saw white airflow gush from beneath the shell. It was the snow on the ground that had been blown up by the explosion and looked like a misty flower. The demonic beast stopped advancing at last, as if it was unable to withstand the burden it was carrying. Its gigantic shell fell rumbling to the ground. Black blood gushed out from beneath the shell and soaked the ground. Ooh! There was a burst of cheer in the crowd. Vanner fell and sat on the ground. Only then did he realize that cold sweat had soaked through his clothes. When everyone thought so, the horn sounded loudly again on the border. Another herd of demonic beasts emerged from the horizon and came toward border town. Chapter 50, The Wall of Flame. Do you feel better? Anna patted Nana on the back. She also felt like throwing up, but she restrained herself. A wounded man was brought to them, and while he was still conscious, he repeated, "Save me, save me." The despair and plea in his eyes was heart-wrenching to watch. When she saw the bowel hanging out of his body, Nana vomited. Even so, she made up her mind to complete the healing. After Brian placed the bowel back to the wounded man's body, Nana reached out her hand and healed the wound with her eyes closed. The little girl seemed a little dispirited. She leaned on Anna and said softly, "Today is the first time I heard the sound of the horn. Did His Highness get into trouble?" "I don't know." Anna shook her head. She wanted to take a look at the city wall so much. But she was also worried that she might only make things more troublesome for Roland. She was now a little envious of Nightingale's power of invisibility, for that power would make going out very convenient. At that time, there was a booming sound from the city wall. Everyone felt a slight vibration. Brian stood up and walked to and fro impatiently in the room. "Take it easy, lad." Baron Pine was wiping his sword. Losing patience before going to the battlefield would only make bad things worse. Not to mention, now things are still far from bad. "I'm sorry, Your Excellency," Brian answered. "I just can't calm down. I just don't want to sit here wasting my time while others are fighting on the city wall at the cost of their lives. Defending this little town should have been my duty." "Perhaps." Pine shrugged his shoulders. "But the duty of defending the town doesn't belong to you alone. I've heard that His Highness will grant you the title of knighthood. Then you should understand that a knight's foremost duty is loyalty. If he asked you to protect Anna, then it would be your duty to obey." "You're right." Brian returned to his seat after a moment's hesitation. But soon, they heard the second horn blow, more desperate than the first and rumbling like a thunder in everyone's heart. Pine frowned. "Anna!" Nana cried out in surprise. When he turned his head, he saw the witch walking directly to the door. Brian caught up and stood in front of her. "Didn't you say that you wanted to defend the city wall?" "Now it's time," Anna said calmly. "As long as you come with me, you aren't disobeying the order of His Highness." Brian became bewildered. He turned his gaze to Pine. The Baron thought to himself, "What she said makes sense. The prince didn't make it a rule that she should only stay at the hospital. According to Nana, she can summon fire. If things are really urgent, the participation of a witch might turn the situation around." Finishing his thought, he nodded. "Take care of her." "Yes, I will." Brian became spirited instantly and replied cheerfully. Seeing the two leaving, Nana asked, "Father, will you go to the battlefield?" "My battlefield is right here, my sweet one." The Baron smiled. "Whether they're demonic beasts or demons, I'll never let them hurt you." The city wall was not far from the hospital. Anna and Brian ran eastward on the flagstone pavement along the wall. When they came to the central lookout tower, they realized things had escalated for the worse. The city wall had then a huge opening. Roland's guards were defending the opening with shields, but still, a few of them were knocked down. Among the demonic beasts, there was one with the look of a boar that was particularly ferocious. The guards at the front who got hit were almost sent flying with their shields. "Hey, it's dangerous here." You should leave right now," someone warned when he saw Anna in her strange outfit. Anna acted as if she had heard nothing. She walked directly to the opening. When the demonic beast made its way through the crowd, it turned and headed for Anna. Brian the guard came to the side speedily, lowered his body and waved his sword horizontally. The frenetic beast did not dodge, and one of its forelegs hit the blade and sent the sword flying, while the force of its own body weight severed the leg. It fell down shrieking and struggled like a fish out of water. No one dared to come close. Anna walked near it and placed her hands on the ground. Soon fire rose from under its body and quickly burned it into charcoal. Roland also noticed the flame that emerged all of a sudden. When he found that it was Anna who did it, his heart almost leaped out of his chest. That was never in his plan. He had planned to make Nana win the affection of the militia first. After most of the people had accepted witches as one of them, he would slowly make Anna known to them. But now it was too late. He said immediately to Nightingale, "Pay no more attention to me now. Protect her first. No harm must come to Anna. She's the key in the development of industrialization. If she was injured, the loss would be immeasurable," thought Roland. "Got it," Nightingale replied. "Take care of yourself as well." Anna walked to the opening. Roland's guards made way for her since they had all seen this girl in the strange outfit many times. She stood right in a wall of shields, stretching her arms out horizontally. Flames grew from her hand like vines and climbed onto the surface of the city wall where the opening lay. Everyone who saw this wonderful scene was dumbfounded. They could not believe their eyes when they saw a wall of flame rise unhurriedly and fill the opening in the city wall. This, however, could not be an illusion, because the high temperature of the flame made the guards step back involuntarily and the snow around melted instantly, giving rise to dense white mist. The demonic beast also felt the heat of the flame wall. They fled from it, though a few still darted into the flame before they soon burned in it. "Everyone, get to the top of the city wall." Roland grabbed the chance and shouted, "Spear Squad, resume your formation. Hunter Squad, fire." After saying this he grabbed Carter's flintlock and ascended the wall, shooting at the demonic beasts which had no way out. The prince's action inspired everyone. After all, in this era, the noble and the royal members hardly fought in the front. When Prince Roland chose to fight with the militia whom he had selected from the common people, it seemed inspiring indeed. Everyone shouted, "Defend border town! Fight for His Highness and resume the defensive formation," as if the city wall had never been damaged. The fight lasted till dusk. There was eventually no more demonic beasts alive in front of the city wall. The flame gradually dimmed and vanished. Anna wiped the dampness from her forehead and walked out of the opening. Then Roland saw an incredible scene. The guards all touched their chest and nodded respectfully to her. The militia, as if affected by the guards, watched her quietly. No one shouted demon or sorceress. Peace prevailed at the moment on the border. An unknown power was dreadful indeed. But when the owner of it stood by the people's side and fought against the evil with them, trust and gratitude would gradually replace fear. Roland tried to suppress his excitement and walked over to Anna, only to find her pale and staggering. It seemed she would collapse any minute. "Are you okay?" He held the maiden's shoulders worryingly, while the latter gave a faint smile, passed out and fell in his arms.